declare open this hearing of the Senate Community Affairs References Committee's inquiry into the issues related to menopause and perimenopause. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. The committee will be conducting today's hearing in person and via video conference. I'm Senator Penny Allman-Payne, Chair of the committee, and I'm joined in the room today by Senators Marielle Smith, Senators Maria Kavasic and Senator Waters, and also to be joined by Senators Pratt and Hughes. These are public proceedings being audio streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all senators that as we continue our work implementing the standard report as Chair, I will ensure that proceedings are conducted in an orderly, respectful and courteous way. Real and perceived conflict of interest can negatively affect public confidence in the integrity of inquiries. As such, the committee encourages all witnesses participating in the hearing today to declare to the committee any matters, whether of pecuniary or other interest, where there may be or may be perceived to be a possible conflict of interest. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. I remind witnesses who are appearing via video conference and who are not speaking to mute their microphones. Further, I take the opportunity to remind all witnesses to ensure that their opening statements do not exceed 3 minutes, to ensure that all senators participating in this evening's hearing are given the opportunity to ask questions. Thank you. I now welcome representatives from the University of Western Australia, Dr Danny Barrington and Dr Antonia Hendrick. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could I please ask you to state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today, and I'll start with Dr Barrington.
Hi, I'm Dr Danny Barrington. I'm representing the UWA School of Population and Global Health.
And Dr Hendrick?
Hello, my name's Antonia Hendrick. I'm from the School of Allied Health, Social Work and Social Policy, Senior Lecturer.
Thank you. I now invite you to make a short 3-minute opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Okay, I'll start out. Good evening, Senators. I'm a non-clinical researcher specialising in understanding and improving lived experiences of menstruation, from menarche to post-menopause, particularly through participatory research and advocating for systemic change. A few years ago, I developed a highly cited model of menstrual experiences in high-income countries, bringing together all of the qualitative research that has been conducted globally since the mid-1900s. Although I am proud of the model, which demonstrates the causes and impacts of poor menstrual experiences, I'm cognizant that the majority of the voices that have been heard have been economically advantaged, white, straight, non-disabled, cisgendered women, often who work in offices. This also holds true with what we currently know about experiences of the menopause transition more specifically. I don't want to belittle the courage of the many individuals who have come forward to share their experiences, both during this inquiry and through other avenues. They are an important part of the puzzle, but they are only a piece. I worry that we are missing many voices by not taking an intersectional approach to understanding the experiences of the wide range of people who go through the menopause transition in Australia. Although in the past 5 years we have seen more studies into the menstrual experiences of those who are economically disadvantaged, the government response to this has tended to focus on quick fixes, such as removing the tax and providing menstrual products to students in schools. These are welcome changes, but they have not shifted many of the systemic barriers that are leading to entrenched and harmful behavioural expectations and barriers related to menstruation. They focused on a single vulnerability without then zooming out to consider the larger problem. Last week, I hosted a community conversation with people experiencing the menopause transition in non-office workplaces. They were from a variety of cultural backgrounds and several did not identify as cis women. This reinforced my understanding that we have not heard from many parts of Australian society yet. At the request of several participants in that forum, I urge the senators to consider the evidence they have heard, but I also advocate for further research and consultation with other groups in our society. Those who identify as trans, gender non-binary, intersex or another gender, those with disabilities, those who are economically disadvantaged, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders, COLD community members, those working in non-office environments, particularly those which are male-dominated, and those experiencing other vulnerabilities that I haven't mentioned. We must also be careful not to generalise experiences within these categories, acknowledging that every individual's experiences are unique and that many live with an assortment of vulnerabilities which interact with the experiences of the menopause transition and symptoms. By understanding a wide range of experiences, we can develop more contextually relevant programming and policies. There are clearly immediate actions that can be taken that will improve experiences of the menopause transition for all Australians. But in addition to this, we need to consider carefully how much our actions going forward are based on the experiences of the few rather than the many. Thank you.
Thank you. And just before we continue, I might just let the folks online know that there are some people filming in the room, and so just checking that everyone is comfortable with that. Yes. All right. Dr. Hendrick, did you have any opening remarks you wanted to make, or are you happy for us to go to questions?
I do have some opening remarks.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Honourable Senators, thank you for this opportunity to address a deeply personal and profoundly universal issue, menopause. As I stand before you, I carry my own experiences, echoing those of countless others who have navigated this journey, often in silence, often unaware, and often alone. My understanding of menopause has only deepened through my own experiences over the past 18 months. During this time, supervising students' research through the Public Policy Institute at UWA has further illuminated the critical need for open discussion to reduce the shame, embarrassment and significant impacts menopause has across our social, cultural and economic lives. Imagine, if you will, the rush of heat throughout your body, a hot flush, the relentless pain of migraines several times a week, sleepless nights that stretch into exhausting days, sudden bursitis in your hips, sharp pains down your legs, and an increased risk of frozen shoulder, among many other menopausal symptoms. These are not just symptoms, they are experiences that can make it difficult to function at work, to think clearly, or to simply get through the day. For some, the cost of treatments and specialist appointments adds another layer of burden, one that many cannot afford to bear. While I have been fortunate enough to access the resources I need, I recognise that this is not the reality for everyone. After all, I am white, middle class, and have few, if any, barriers to accessing the treatments I need. There are voices we don't hear, people who may not even know that what they are experiencing is indeed menopause. For women from marginalised communities, for those who live in remote areas, and for those who face economic hardships, the challenges are even greater. The lack of awareness, the stigma and the disparities in healthcare access all contribute to a silence that is as damaging as the symptoms themselves. We must acknowledge our privilege and use it to amplify those unheard voices. This brings me to the urgent need for more research and recognition. Menopause affects half of the population, yet it remains under-researched and often overlooked. We need comprehensive studies that address the diverse experiences of menopause, particularly for individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. We need policies that support all individuals experiencing menopause, not just in the workplace, but in every aspect of life. As Australia's population ages, more individuals are entering the menopause transition, raising significant questions about workplace culture, productivity and inclusivity. We need rigorous research to understand these broader societal impacts and develop evidence-based policies that respond to the needs of all individuals experiencing menopause. I urge this committee to consider these points carefully. This inquiry is a critical step towards addressing the direct and indirect impacts of menopause on individuals and society. Effective policy requires bipartisan support and a commitment to ensuring all individuals have equal health, wellbeing, employment and civic participation opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll go to Senator Waters.
Thanks very much both for joining us. Sorry we missed you in Perth, but it's great we can get the benefit of your expertise this evening. You'll have to forgive the noise of the bells in the background. It's a Parliament day for us, so if the red ones go off, we'll have to all bolt. But you've got us for the time being. Can I start off with Dr. Barrington? You referenced in your lovely, appropriately inclusive opening statement that you'd reflected recently on the needs of people who identify as women and have ovaries outside of an office-based environment. Can you just run us through what those people asked for? What were some common themes in what they wanted to better support them during perimenopause and menopause?
Yeah, great. So in that community conversation, we recruited people. We had people who work in kitchens, in warehouses, on forklifts, a really wide range of different non-office workplaces. And for them, they felt that there was a big gap or a big need for flexibility. Mm-hmm. There was a need for more supportive workplaces in terms of men being educated, so that they felt that they could speak about these things and also ask for the flexibility that they needed. There was also just a lack of knowledge about, for example, we had an Indigenous woman who said, do white women have the same symptoms? Is this just something that we're going through because we're Aboriginal women? And so actually trying to understand and educate ourselves about the different symptoms that are normal and in different parts of society and how they might interact with our different experiences.
Thank you.
They're probably the main things.
Yeah, thank you. That's useful. Can I just go to the point about flexibility? We've been examining in the course of this committee, and we'll need to form a view, about whether workplace accommodation should be flexibility or should extend to the ability to ask for leave for reproductive health issues or for perimenopause issues and menopause specifically. So basically flexibility and or leave. Did any of the folk that you spoke with express a view about whether they'd prefer flexibility to leave, or did they want both, or what was the take on that?
So we didn't specifically ask about leave. We said, are there any things that help make your life at work easier? With the group that I worked with, people were speaking specifically about flexibility, about, I guess, what we would have said 20 years ago, having a smoko sort of break, some time just to go and get some fresh air and then come back when you felt okay. Antonia, did you have anything else to add from that event?
Yeah, I guess the other thing that they talked about was a sense of shame, so not being able to speak out. So the freedom to speak openly about what they were experiencing was something that they also expressed. Otherwise, it was suffering in silence. But as you said, Danny, it's stepping out, water, fans, ability to cool themselves and so on.
Okay, thank you. Because just sorry to harp on about this, but did in their mention of flexibility, did that include? I know you've said short breaks, and we've heard that previously as well. Did anyone conceive of flexibility as the ability to request to work from home on certain days if had an absolutely terrible night's sleep or they're just feeling rotten?
So I think it wasn't really talked about in this group of people because they weren't professions where people could work from home.
Yes, okay. So flexibility is constrained by the nature of the work environment. Yeah. Okay. All right, thank you. Dr. Hendrick, do we know, we've heard so far that there's an appalling lack of research by or about First Nations women going through this time of life. What have you learnt so far about the unique experiences of First Nation women in peri and menopause?
Thank you for that question. Very little actually is known. So I don't know of any particular research myself other than the small amount of research that the student that I supervised came across, and that was related to an area in the Pilbara here in WA. And it was really just related to the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait, people of that particular area talked about menopause as the change. But it really did identify the need for further information related to the different experiences of minority groups and other cultural groups as well.
Do you have, noting that absolute lacuna of research, do you have any recommendations for how the federal government could support the development of a research basis, or could simply support First Nations women in this time of life?
Danny will probably have some views on this as well, but I guess my first response to that is that we need to hear more of the voices of people themselves as they are experiencing this change in life. I mean, that was really powerful to have that community conversation that Danny ran last week, and really hearing from the women and their experiences was quite profound. I feel as though there needs to be more research that works with the women around what are you experiencing, what are the sorts of things that is going to improve, your social, economic and so on lot in life, the various aspects.
Can I
Danny?
add to that, Senator? I've used lots of different participatory approaches, and what has struck me with the Senate inquiry is that the general public don't know there's an inquiry, and if they do, they may not know they can make submissions. They may not feel that making a written submission is something that they are entitled to do or feel like they can do. And so I really recommend having more ways, different fora for finding out about different experiences, yarning circles, allowing people to make short videos or audio recordings, online surveys. That's really, we find in the research that I do around this here and elsewhere in the world, is giving people a variety of ways to express themselves can help you understand more experiences.
Okay, thank you very much, and appreciate the work you've done in this space. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Pratt.
Thank you. Can I ask, in the context, Dr. Barrington, of the diversity of research that you've looked at, and perhaps Dr. Hendrick as well, given your research in the School of Allied Health, what analysis, if any, have either of you done of the existing health research in Australia around perimenopause and menopause? For example, the Women's Health Survey oversighted by, I think it's Jean Hales. Sorry, I'm just having a menopausal symptom in my perimenopausal symptom in my shoulder. Just excuse me, I had a pinch. Go on.
Do you want to respond to that, Danny? Or
Sorry, if you've got something to say, go ahead.
all I have to say in response to that, and that's a very good question, and I guess for me that opens up the gap to the fact that there is very little known. I have only stumbled into this. I'm a menopausal woman myself over the last 18 months. So a lot of the research was not something that came across my desk or something that I have been a part of, except for through supervising the student. And we know, working quite closely with Grace Malloy, Menopause Friendly, and various other stakeholders now, and listening to the women, that there is a dire need for research. I can't speak to anything that I have specifically been involved in to this point, but know that we need to be doing something.
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind taking on notice, going away to have a look at that. I'm sure it's probably within your academic purview to do that in any case. Look, my looking at it firsthand myself, it seemed to be quite a diverse cohort of women that they were asking that had been selected using statistical sampling. So I'm not entirely aware of the extent to which they, would get women who worked, for example, in aged care or in trades. But, it looked to me like it had that baseline, but that the nature of the questions was very much framed about you would already have had to have attributed a particular symptom or effect to perimenopause or menopause, rather than necessarily acknowledging the fact that women have such little information about it in many cases that they struggle to attribute that. So if you could go away and have a look at how some of the messaging in that, not messaging, that research to assist us to interpret it, that would be helpful. And of course, Jean Hales can speak to that research themselves as well.
Yep.
Thank you.
Great.
And in that context, Dr. Barrington, you have pulled together research from diverse places. You might like to take on notice the opportunity to tell us what good research looks like in the form of, some correspondence to the committee. We've now got your verbal evidence, really calling on us to make sure that diversity is there.
Okay, great. I'm happy to do that.
That would be terrific. I think I can probably leave that there. Thank you, Chair.
All right, thanks, Senator Pratt. Senator Kavasic.
Thank you, and thank you for your evidence today. I had a question around the sense of shame that was discussed earlier. Did you find that this was talking about it more broadly in the workplace or amongst family, or was it just something in general where this sense of shame came in? If you could sort of elaborate a little bit around what that looked like and what the conversations about that were.
In the specific community conversation, we were focusing on discussions in the workplace.
Yeah.
So that's where it was there. Sorry, Antonia, did you have something else?
Yeah, but there was also the implied nature of this particular individual who was sharing a sense of shame and how that was experienced, that as a result of that, wanting to really advocate for community in this instance, and sisters and aunts and daughters, in order to educate and to make a difference, because the experience that she had was quite isolating and in the first instance was around this idea of shame and not knowing what was going on, and didn't want that same experience for family members, community and wider. So was really taking the educative role around this and, exploring the topic and what was going on.
And sort of to that end, and a question for both of you, are there any specific things that you think that could be done in relation to that educative role, about how that could be done better and what that could potentially look like?
I think, the simplest thing to do, but a place to start is obviously having more menopause education in schools. And not just about it from a biological standpoint. I mean, symptoms are also important, but also to give some more idea of what the lived experiences are like for people. I know that our colleague, Professor Paul McGinn, would also say that we need to make sure that we're educating men, and that might look different how we're educating other people in the society. And so I guess similarly to what I've been calling for is we need research where we actually hear from men how this would be best done, rather than making assumptions about how best to communicate with them.
Sure. Thank you. That's it from me, Chair.
All right. Look, thank you very much for your evidence today. The committee will report to the Senate on the 17th of September 2024, and we request that the answers to the questions taken on notice could be provided to the committee secretariat by close of business on Friday the 23rd of August 2024. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I now welcome Adjunct Professor Robin Langham, AM, from the Australian Medical Council.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much for appearing before the committee this evening. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you're appearing this evening?
So my name is Professor Robin Langham. I'm the chair of the Australian Medical Council Specialist Education Accreditation Committee, and I'm a board director at the Australian Medical Council. I'm representing the council at this session. I should add I'm also a member of the Australian Public Service. I'm the Chief Medical Advisor for the TGA, and you'll be hearing from me again in that regard in a little while. There is no overlap between my two roles.
All right, thank you. Professor Langham, I now invite you to make a short 3-minute opening statement, and then once you've concluded, we'll move to questions.
Thank you. So I am a nephrologist by training, a kidney doctor, but I was also previously the head of Monash University's Rural Clinical School, educating young doctors in an attempt to improve rural workforce. The Australian Medical Council is the appointed accreditation authority for medical education in Australia. We do develop accreditation standards through a regulatory framework for medical programs across all phases of medical education. We assess those medical programs and their providers against these standards, and we accredit programs that meet these standards. And as well, we have a role in assessing international medical graduates that seek registration to practice medicine in Australia. In terms of medical schools, the standards that require graduates to have experience in diverse clinical settings in order to achieve the graduate outcomes in a range of disciplines, including women's health. And the standards require graduates to demonstrate specifically, there are 2 standards. One is that they apply whole person care principles in clinical practice, including considering a patient's physical, mental, developmental, emotional, social, economic, environmental, cultural and spiritual needs and their geographic location. And as well, the standards that they apply scientific knowledge and clinical skills to care for patients across their lifespan, including as children, as adolescents, as ageing people and patients in pregnancy and childbirth. So our expectation is that perimenopause and menopause is being taught, that students have experiences in general practice and hospital-based disciplines and mental health settings where the women of Australia seek their health services. For pre-vocational training, the standards are split across 4 main domains of undifferentiated illness, chronic illness, acute and critical and peri-procedural, again expected to demonstrate whole person care and with a revised framework that allows flexibility of pre-vocational graduates to achieve their expected outcomes in community practice, such as general practice. So where doctors are able to spend more time in their early career years in general practice settings. For specialist training, the AMC does not prescribe learning outcomes for each medical discipline. There are 87 specialist and subspecialist areas of practice that we have a responsibility for oversight. So we can't mandate any part of a curriculum, but we do require standards for each of those specialties, and particularly that the college develops and maintains a set of program outcomes for each of its specialist medical programs that take account of community needs and medical health practice. And the provider relates its training and education functions to the healthcare needs of the community that it serves. I might just finish with the other role, which is continuing professional practice. And in general, all medical practitioners who are not in a pre-vocational or specialist training program are required to undertake continuous professional development in order to maintain registration in Australia. That practitioner must undertake 50 hours of CPD annually, but not just education, but also what we call a higher value CPD, which requires at least 25 hours of reviewing their performance and measuring their outcomes. So this provides an opportunity and a mechanism for broad upskilling of doctors as new research, new clinical protocols and toolkits emerge. And it relies on learning and reflective tools being accessible and authoritative. Senator, I think that's my 3 minutes. I heard her.
Thank you very much, Professor Langham. I'm going to go to Senator Smith to start.
Thank you, Professor, for appearing before us today. We really appreciate it. I just want to dig a bit more deeply into just who makes the decisions, particularly in universities, around what our medical students are learning and how much time they're spending on different things. I'm sure you would be across the evidence we've received to date, where we're hearing medical students might only get one lecture which covers issues of perimenopause and menopause through their undergraduate training, given it's something which will affect every single woman, so half the population at least one point in their life. This is something as a committee I think we universally found a bit concerning. At our hearing in Adelaide, in a bit of a roundabout way, it seemed to be the case that it's the medical deans who determine that. But can you just shed any light on that? Who actually gets to make that call around the time devoted to different topics in the undergraduate curriculum?
Well, that would be the role of the medical school. It is the Australian Medical Council's role to evaluate the performance of each of those medical schools against the standards that I've mentioned. And our standards certainly talk about a whole of life cycle requirement and a whole of patient care as well. So we don't have a regulatory framework that allows us granularity in that sense, and we do certainly evaluate each of the universities against those standards.
Okay, but that's a broader standard, so
Correct.
You wouldn't go into the detail of menopause specifically. And
Correct. Having said that, if at any of our register or assessments or accreditation visits, if we felt that a particular college or university wasn't addressing a particular area of need as the standards demand, then we would be setting conditions and asking the colleges or the universities to improve their practice and to fill the need that would have been identified as deficit.
And what would trigger a process like that?
So each of the colleges and the universities have formal accreditation processes. There is a 10-year cycle that each of them go through. So a major accreditation visit would happen at year one, and then the accreditation be awarded depending on the performance of the particular medical provider for a period of 4 to 6 years, after which there would be a further visit, and then up until renewals up until the 10-year cycle. And those visits are fairly intensive. They do have it's almost a desktop approach where the university or the college would have to provide us with evidence that they are meeting each of the standards, and then there's a face-to-face visit. There's a lot of triangulation with other stakeholders as well. Sorry. It's a bit hot.
Definitely the place to do it.
No, thank you. I'm free to flush. That's on Hansard now.
Yeah.
So it's a quite intensive multi-stakeholder. We would talk to medical students, we would talk to trainees, we would talk to the supervisors, we would talk to the university's educator, the college's educator, all of those sort of different moving parts of a college to ensure that each of the standards are met to a very granular fashion. And where there is identified an opportunity to improve, then a condition may be set in order for universities to be able to identify where their deficits are and create a program of improvement. And that's something that they would then report back to us on a yearly basis.
And so would one lecturer in the course of an undergraduate degree on menopause cut it?
I think it's a bit hard for me to sort of address that particularly. I don't think I can answer that one. I could certainly take that on notice and ask my accreditation team what sort of processes that might trigger. It might trigger a process of for example, if there's not enough time spent in general practice, being able to understand or deliver the care that comes from that lecture might be a more important process than just the one lecture itself. But I certainly think it would be a much more complex question than just the one lecture itself.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I ask this because the evidence we've received on this has often come from GPs themselves who say they would have loved to have more training in menopause and, until they started practising. And half the population which they serve will go through it at some point, don't then feel well prepared to be able to provide, at least initially, that level of support. So I've spoken to GPs who then have gone and sought further professional development, and that's fantastic. But they've raised with us this concern about what is being taught at an undergraduate level to everyone, given, it's not just the sort of standard symptoms that we hear about, but there's a whole other range of interplays and interactions.
What we ask of medical schools, is to provide a graduate that is skilled in the foundations of all systems and disciplines, that is able to be safe and develop from that point. I honestly consider the notion that you learn everything you need to know at medical school and then the day you graduate is the start of your decline and that you finally hit a critical point 2 days before you retire.
We'd hope not.
That's no longer, the perception of medical schools. I think what we have in an opportunity in medical school is to be able to produce graduates that are able to have an insight and to be able to respond to new information and new knowledges. And I think equally that's probably the role of not only the medical schools but also the regulator as well. If you like, the regulatory framework that we have is not as agile or as responsive to these sorts of changes in research, in new health outcomes, and I think it's fairly well agreed that new knowledge is expanding at such a rate that we can't really afford to be able to be sort of trying to overregulate curriculum detail for someone in their first year of medical school when 6 years later that knowledge is going to be very different. But I think what we're really challenged to do is how to keep a system up to date with knowledge, an entire medical system. And I think you're hearing very loud and clear of the need for more research and more data that is coming from the authoritative people, that is relevant to all practitioners, that is relevant to medical students, that is relevant to pre-vocational students, that is relevant to college trainees, that is relevant to the old doctor that's been around for a very long time. It's how we know that this is an issue for all of the medical education sector. We know that this is a challenge, and I think what we can do collectively is, and this is what we are doing, is collaborating with the universities, with the colleges, in order to provide guidance, to provide endorsement, to support a sharing of practice that is much more agile and useful and contemporary in nature than can be achieved by an overbearing bureaucratic regulatory process.
Thank you. I think, as we look towards our recommendations, I think we've heard a lot of evidence around the support being provided to women when they go seek clinical care. Conscious that our GPs have a lot on their plates and are trying to do a lot and stay on top of a lot under, a pretty competitive and at times difficult environment. As we look to make those recommendations, what do you think is helpful in making sure that GPs feel well equipped, well supported and up to date with good quality information so they can help their patients who we know they care about, but also which balances the need for women to feel confident that when they go and seek out the support of their GP or a clinician, they're going to have good quality advice and not be sort of given the runaround or feel dismissed?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to ask the regulatory body that oversees education, understanding that. But, I think this is a really, really complex issue. And as a patient myself, trying to navigate different areas that I had no knowledge about, but equally understanding that my GP has a variability of experience and a variability of knowledge. And, I really think for us to be able to focus on being able to support a system that provides up-to-date knowledge that is supported by research and data. I still think that a lot of the research and data that's needed is not there in its depth that's needed, but it's how that research and data is translated into accessible information that is contemporary and ready. You will have heard of some of the stories about older research findings that really made every doctor very afraid to prescribe hormonal replacement therapy for fear of giving every woman breast cancer. For me, it's a matter of having a knowledge system, a supportive knowledge system that applies right across the spectrum of practitioner from day one of medical school until day whatever of our medical practice, that is accessible, that is contemporary, that is up to date, that is helpful in supporting that GP, that is also helpful in supporting the patient in their journey.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thanks, Chair.
Senator Kovacic.
Thank you. Thinking about that knowledge system and a lot of the evidence that we've heard, where women have struggled to get the understanding or treatment that they need. How do we embed that knowledge system in now? And you've talked about the continuing professional development and practice and all of that. What changes can we make now to go, okay, we get that there is so much to do and so many things that a general practitioner has to do, but how do we sort of create a circuit breaker and go, well, this is really important. It's a universal problem for women at a point in their lives.
Well, I think I've mentioned before that there is a need for collaboration in this space, in being able to provide guidance and endorsement of particular tools, of particular learning opportunities, and also for a sharing of practice amongst those the universities and the colleges in order to be able to support them. I think also, and this perhaps is a role for the AMC, being able to monitor the adoption and uptake of some of those tools as they become available, as they are very much evidence-based and research-based. It is possible for us all to be able to monitor their uptake. So I think it's perhaps not as simplistic as being able to shove the knowledge in, but it's also how it is accessible, how people learn best, but also to be able to monitor and to provide that research that what you are providing is working.
Yeah, I guess the problem is that we need to get the knowledge in there, so we need to find a way to do that. Do you think part of the solution could be becoming prescriptive in those continuing professional development points? And I think you talked about 20 odd hours a year, in saying that X number of hours needs to be around in this space in order to maintain registration. Would that be a way of getting the knowledge in there?
Well, I think it's not up to the AMC to specify knowledge. The essential premise of CPD in its current state is that it's practitioner-driven, that the practitioner identifies where their deficits are and identifies and plans to learn that knowledge throughout the year.
I'm familiar with how CPD works. So whose job is it then to ensure that the knowledge is there?
As I said, this is the practitioner's role to be able to identify where their knowledge gaps are and then to seek out that learning. So there are CPD homes that oversee practitioners in terms of their CPD journey. And the CPD homes would have a role in supporting a practitioner for finding that information if they're seeking help.
Got you. I think I've asked the wrong question. I understand that the CPD for all professionals is individually driven, whether you're a doctor or in financial services or whatever. What I'm trying to understand is whose job is it to ensure that medical practitioners, when they leave university or as they're now developing throughout their career, actually do have knowledge or understanding around these women's health issues. So who needs to ensure that when a doctor graduates, they understand the impacts or what to look for in relation to perimenopause and menopause?
So I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit confused myself. Are we talking about new graduates, new medical school graduates?
Well, let's start there, yeah. Let's start there. And then ongoing, whose job is it? If someone doesn't know or doesn't understand or there's new technology, whose job is it to ensure, or new treatment, whose job is it to ensure that they have an understanding or a knowledge, or is that piece all individually driven?
So I guess there's two parts of it. The university obviously is the organisation that sets the curriculum and does the assessment. So there's your piece of work that says, yes, this person who's just graduated is, equipped in all the foundations and the skills to be able to step forward safely in that space. And the university, if you like, is accredited according to those standards.
So each uni needs to determine those foundations and skills to ensure they meet the criteria
Correct.
under which they can offer or confer the degree.
Correct,
Right.
yes. There is another regulator for universities, which is TEXA, but they don't tend to stray into the medical side of things specifically. For the trainee doctor, there is, again, standards and supervision and governance requirements in place for that spot between medical school and the colleges. And then for the colleges, it's their responsibility in terms of being able to set curriculum and to assess and evaluate capacity and ability to practice in that particular specialty, which is judged against those standards. For someone who's graduated, also who's moved beyond the college, for a lot of them, they remain fellows of the college, they remain members of the college, so are still within that learning environment, still have the benefit of that sort of guidance and often a peer-driven network of learning, and opportunities are provided to them. But for ongoing learning and development, it really is the practitioner's role to identify where their particular needs are. The new registration guidelines did also introduce a requirement for a professional development plan, so that each practitioner at least has a plan of the sorts of learning that needs to be done in their own sort of settings for the coming year, and then has the ability to sort of obviously look back and see where or when. So there is that sort of overarching opportunity to have a guidance of their learning.
Okay, thank you. That's it from me, Chair.
Senator Waters.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Professor, for your time and all the work that you do. I'm sorry to probably go over the same ground that we've just covered, but I'm still struggling to understand why we don't have a standardised curriculum that has a key focus on women's health for all people that will become doctors. It sounds like that's just not how the system is structured, and I hear you on that, but why? And what would need to change so that we can guarantee a level of education around women's health generally, but specifically perimenopause and menopause, which more than 50% of the population will experience? It just seems a no-brainer to make that a core component of every single medical school.
Well, I think it's fair to say that every medical university, every medical school's curriculum is evaluated for its breadth and depth against the standards that have been set. I'm wary of suggesting mandating particular areas in any curriculum would be useful, because the knowledge is changing so quickly. So rather than say you've got to learn about, blue toes on your left foot, understanding that in 6 years' time the knowledge and the information around that particular condition will have changed dramatically. So for a university's curriculum to actually produce a graduate that is skilled across all of foundations, but also able to learn and develop and identify and query and fill in those gaps as they go on, so that the knowledge journey, if you like, of a medical graduate is an upward rise and not that sort of gradual decline. I think prescribing on a very granular level is, someone used the word hard coding, and I think that makes us inflexible. So ensuring that, yes, every curriculum is broad, and yes, every curriculum addresses the full life cycle, of which an AMC evaluator would go, here's women's health, here's paediatrics, here's this and here's that, in order to be able to ensure that the full life cycle is being addressed, is the regulatory approach to ensuring that all aspects of a life cycle of care is dealt with.
Okay, so one of your standards is about women's health.
Yes, I did read out the requirement for ensuring, I've lost it already, Yes. Scientific knowledge, clinical skills to care for patients across their lifespan. And so
that's what you're calling women's health?
That is including children, adolescents, ageing people and patients in pregnancy and childbirth.
What about after pregnancy and childbirth?
That's the standard that I've read. Ageing probably does come into perimenopause and menopause as well.
So who writes those standards?
That's a good question.
Those sounds like a man.
Oh, that's a bit harsh, Larissa.
I know.
We actually have a chair of our standards
committee. It's been a long day. I'm saying what I really think now.
I apologise. You probably...
I don't mean to offend you personally.
No, you have those same experiences that I have. So the standards for each of the 3 different areas that we oversee are regularly reviewed. The medical school standards were recently revised. The process is a process of a working group, broad consultation, and then bringing everything together, consulting again prior to implementation. So it's a really broad, overarching approach. At the moment, we are going through the process of reviewing the standards for the Specialist Education Advisory Committee. We have a female chairing that.
Good. More of that, please.
And the working group is a representative of a broad sector of the educational community, of the colleges, of consumers, of First Nations community, and we're also hoping to be able to bring in LGBTQI and COLD communities on an as-needs basis.
Good. That sounds positive. Can I just interrupt? And I'm sorry to do so, but we're up against the clock. When will that particular standard that you referred to that had pregnancy and childbirth but then stopped and didn't include specific mention of perimenopause or menopause or any other issues for women as they age, when will that particular standard be reviewed? And would you at that point consider actively referencing perimenopause and menopause?
That's the medical school standard, which has just been rewritten and it's been implemented, I think, about a year ago. So that won't be up for review now for another 6 years. It might be 6 years. I would have to check on that precisely.
Right. And there's no ability to do an interim review to
I don't know the answer to that question.
More to do in their lives than just have babies?
I don't know the answer to that question, Larissa. I'd have to find out.
Yeah,
and I will
if you wouldn't mind, that would be great.
Happy
and can
to
I just my second tranche, and then I'll stop interrupting, I promise. You talked earlier about hard coding and not being too specific. I totally understand that the content of the material that's taught needs to be the most up to date. However, I'm not saying that you need to have a fixed body of knowledge that gets taught and is never revised. What I'm suggesting, what the committee's deliberating, is should you have a dedicated period of time in the undergraduate curriculum and for training going forwards that is about perimenopause and menopause. And naturally it would be the most up-to-date information available at the time. What's the barrier to that kind of concept getting a chunk of time dedicated to it?
Look, it's a good question. And I really will have to check on this one for you. But my understanding is that by having a very high level standard that refers to the entire life cycle of a person, that is included in there, and that a university, when they were undergoing evaluation for their curriculum, that was missing big chunks of a life cycle approach, would be evaluated very negatively in that fashion, and they would be asked to address the deficit.
Has that ever happened?
I don't know. I'm not involved with the medical school evaluation or assessment. I would have to find out for you, and I will do that for you.
Thank you for taking a lot of questions on notice for me. I appreciate that.
That's okay.
Professor Langham, I might just ask a couple of questions and then I'm going to go to Senator Pratt. I'm interested in this idea, I guess, maybe this is an observation, that when you read out that standard, you talked about children, adolescents, there was clear stuff around pregnancy and birth and ageing, and I think it was probably a bit of a throwaway comment, but you said that, menopause is part of ageing. One of the things that we've heard pretty clearly in this inquiry is that there are many women who are not old who experience menopause or perimenopause, and that's in fact one of the problems, that it's seen as an old woman's issue and therefore it gets missed. And I guess the other thing, so that's maybe an observation, and so I guess I would encourage, as you said, when there are standards reviewed, that I think that's actually missing the point that we've heard in our evidence. But the other point I wanted to make is you talked a lot about, things change over time. And I guess what I'm interested in is it seems to me that the symptoms of menopause are now pretty well understood, and there's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. What we've heard in evidence from large numbers of witnesses isn't just the issue that maybe the treatment is the issue, but the fact that doctors are not even picking up that these symptoms are menopause. And so I guess I'm interested in the education piece. I can understand it if a doctor's reluctant, for example, to prescribe MHT because they're not up on the latest evidence, but it would seem to me that the symptoms of menopause we understand, and yet we've had evidence from dozens upon dozens upon dozens of witnesses who say their doctor can't even tell them that what they're experiencing is menopause. So I guess my question goes to, notwithstanding that treatments change, what are we missing in doctors' education that they can't actually recognise the symptoms of menopause?
I can't really answer that from a regulatory perspective, I'm afraid. I'm not involved with the education, but the regulator will set standards that really should be encompassing the knowledge of menopause and perimenopause. So we would expect that to be being taught.
Does it concern the regulator that so many people have the experience? Like, it's more people than not are saying, my doctor couldn't even tell. It took me until the 5th doctor, the 6th doctor, I had to go and do my own research to even understand that this could be menopause. Is that a concern to the regulator?
Well, look, we know this is a challenge. We know this is an issue, and that's why we are working collaboratively with the other educators, with MEMDANs, with the other colleges in being able to address this and being able to identify, and therapies aside, I know I sit very much in the therapeutic space, but being able to identify where those learning opportunities are, where the tools are, how they can be more accessible so that we can provide guidance, so that we can support, so that we can endorse and improve.
And maybe my final question before I go to Senator Pratt. I think one of the other things that's come through in the inquiry is that there have been instances, and we've also heard this evidence from doctors, where if a doctor feels like they don't know enough, then rather than telling the patient, I don't know, I need to go and investigate that, they basically just either fob them off or do something like give them antidepressants rather than say, well, maybe it could be this, but I'm not actually sure how to treat it. So it seems to me that there's not a good culture within the medical profession more broadly of being willing to tell a patient, I don't know about that specific thing, but I'm willing to work with you and go and collaborate and talk with others. Is part of the medical education around actually the way in which you engage with patients and being willing to say, because I take the point, a general practitioner can't know everything, notwithstanding that I think this is pretty fundamental, but it just seems there's a culture of doctors not being willing to admit when they need to go and find some stuff out, which makes the woman feel like she's either being gaslit or just being passed along a chain.
I understand entirely what you're saying. You've caught me at a little bit of a disadvantage, I should say. There are standards that do reference communication, that do reference exactly what you're talking about. I don't have them in front of me. I'm going to have to do some work on that.
Is there more work to be done on creating a culture within the medical profession of doctors being willing to say, I don't know?
Again, I can't answer that. All I can do is find those standards that do reference professionalism, that do reference ethical behaviour, that do reference exactly what it is that you're talking about.
Okay, Senator Pratt.
Thank you. I have to say, despite apart from the mention of pregnancy and childbirth, I was really struck by how ungendered that framework is, particularly given we know that there's such amount of diversity, that women are more likely to die of a heart attack than breast cancer, despite what the popular culture might tell you, and that there are a whole range of things right throughout the life course that yes, there's a lot of overlap between men and women, but still a lot of it is highly gendered. Can you tell us to what extent is that gender variation in, outcomes and data and the extent to which different chronic illnesses affect men relative to women embedded in the curriculum. And is that perhaps not important when essentially you've got to make a decision for what's in front of you about what's happening to a particular patient?
I can't answer what's embedded in curriculum. The AMC doesn't mandate, the AMC doesn't provide guidance or expectations around those standards. What does happen is the AMC, when we do go to accredit someone, has a very broad range of inputs to their accreditation processes on that. As to the specific experiences of medical school evaluation at the start, I don't have that data, so I couldn't tell you if to what extent that happens.
And to the extent to which, I think the words were differential illness, chronic critical illnesses. If doctors are taught to diagnose and treat in those settings, and perimenopause is a natural phenomenon, isn't it obvious why doctors aren't actually looking for it or having that conversation when it is such a natural part of the life course?
I think what I was talking about was the standards against which pre-vocational doctors the standards against which the educators of pre-vocational doctors. What used to happen was there was doing time in medicine, surgery and emergency medicine. And that was a very hospital-based approach,
So
very
very
acute and pointy end. So being able to change the discussion to an undifferentiated sort of medicine, and also having the flexibility for pre-vocational doctors to be able to train in general practice and not to be trained just in hospitals where menopausal issues would just hardly ever be seen.
Yeah. So if you take it to the next step again, particularly in the context of primary health, prevention, and where, as a long-term strategy, we want our health system to go, and getting the right health advice to people, does it not mean that it should at some point have embedded in it research and data about men and women, as well as social and genetic determinants of health?
I think that's already part of our standards, and we would expect all of the universities and the colleges to be able to be delivering education absolutely based on that. Where we have ongoing challenges in a range of areas, and obviously perimenopause and menopause is something that we do understand that this is an issue, and we recognise the challenges here, is how we can work collaboratively to be able to provide a system that is able to keep all of its practitioners up to date, not just medical students but practitioners, because this data is the same across the whole clinician spectrum.
Yeah. I can totally see, though, from the outline of the structure as you've given it, how, for example, someone in early perimenopause might not get seen in the way those life stages are taught.
Well, again, I've offered to Senator Waters to feed back on the AMC's medical school evaluations to see if there is an oversight of teaching of that part of the curriculum.
And in that context, it would be wonderful if we can get a few examples of that curriculum in terms of how perimenopause and menopause is diagnosed. I know it's diagnosed with largely face-to-face with when you're asked about your symptoms, etc. And it can be diagnosed without a blood test. But it just seems to me that many doctors are sending people off for MRIs, for a whole range of other unnecessary tests, if perhaps they were to consider whether someone's hormones were fluctuating because of perimenopause, and that treating that would alleviate the symptoms.
I just need to clarify. Do you want some examples of the individual medical school curriculums? You'd like me to...
Yeah.
I'll ask the AMC if they're able to access that. It might be that is a question for the individual universities, but I will certainly see what I can do for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Kovacic with a couple of follow-ups.
Thank you. Just in relation to the category that you provided around childhood, adolescence, pregnancy, birth and ageing, are you able to provide on notice that actual document or,
absolutely.
Or where that is?
Publicly available.
Yeah. What is that document called?
It would be called the AMC's Standards into Accreditation of Medical Schools, Medical University, Undergraduate Medical... Something like that. Absolutely.
Yeah. I've been on the website. There are a number of documents, so I couldn't find...
Freely available. So there's one on medical schools, there's one on pre-vocational training, and there's one on colleges.
Okay. And how often... do we know, is that document updated? Because there are a lot of documents on the website that are regularly updated.
Each of those three major groups, and the fourth now, which is the CPD Homes, gets reviewed every 6 years.
Every 6 years. Okay. Thank you. That's it for me, Chair. If we could provide that on notice, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Professor Langham, thank you very much for your evidence this evening. The committee is going to be reporting to the Senate on the 17th of September, and I note that you have taken a few questions on notice, so we just request that they be answers to those questions be provided to the committee secretariat by close of business on Friday, the 23rd of August.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. See you later. I now welcome representatives from the Office for Women, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency and the Fair Work Ombudsman. Thank you very much, everyone, for appearing before the committee this evening. The Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Our Commonwealth officers are also reminded of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised, and a copy of the order is available from the Secretariat if needed. For the Hansard record, could I ask you to state your full name and the capacity in which you're appearing, and we'll start at this end of the table.
Thank you. Rochelle White, Assistant Secretary at the Office for Women, Prime Minister and Cabinet.
Mary Waldridge, the CEO of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency.
Rachel Volsky, Group Manager, Legal and Policy Group, Fair Work Ombudsman.
Thank you very much. Do any of you have a short opening statement?
I was going to make a
Ms. Waldridge.
short statement, if that's okay. Thank you,
Please go
Chair.
ahead.
So thank you for the invitation to appear. As women's participation in the workforce and people increases and people are working longer, it's really positive that we're having this conversation about menopause and perimenopause and its impact at work. WGEA comes from the perspective very much from our advice that we provide to employers and the reporting that employers do to us. To give context, the advice we give to employers on this topic when it's discussed is that to maximise workforce participation and productivity in the context of how we're coming to understand menopause and perimenopause and the impact that it can have for women's workforce participation, employers should provide robust and healthy flexible working practices and policies that support employees at all stages and phases of life, including those experiencing menopause and perimenopause, and implementing it with supportive management. that they should ensure that personal, such as sick leave, is clearly available for reproductive health, such as menopause, and that does not require disclosure of the nature of the condition at work beyond the medical certificate, and that recognising that many women are reluctant to disclose and managers have varied supportiveness and capability to manage reproductive health conversations, and that they should ensure that they have implemented and communicated strong policies and practices on discrimination, harassment and bullying to mitigate the risks of harms associated with stigma. I also wanted to just flag that for the 2022-23 reporting period for employers to report to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, we did ask a voluntary question in our questionnaire that was, do you provide employees paid leave for any of the following in addition to personal or sick leave? And the choices were fertility treatment, menstruation and endometriosis, menopause, gender affirmation or other. We had 10% of employers respond to that voluntary question. So of the 532 that responded, 65 employers said yes, that they provided menopause leave. So I thought that might be useful context. 65 out of the 532 that responded said yes, they had leave, menopause specific leave.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with questions from Senator Kovacic.
Thank you, and thank you for your evidence and for your submission. I'm interested in particular in your submission. You note any reform to address the impacts of menopause in the workplace should be considered carefully and balanced against the possibility of unintended consequences, such as a backlash or further entrenching discrimination against older women, particularly given the economic and workforce barriers already placed. And that's something that quite interests me. Particularly given that we have data that, on average women are retiring at 54. We have some evidence from the UK suggesting that, that menopause leave can actually stigmatise and cause more problems, and then other evidence that suggests it shouldn't really be leave because then that sends the problem home rather than having it central in the workplace where people can actually understand and have learning and have awareness. What are your views on how we deal with an issue like that and what potential things we could put in place to ensure that we actually don't create more problems than we're solving, particularly in the workplace?
Thanks for the question. So the Office for Women made the submission that made that reference. I think we don't have a strong sense of how to prevent the backlash, but are aware that there could be unintended consequences if there was reform in this space, and just simply sought to flag the need to ensure that the emerging evidence is showing there can be backlash. I don't feel like we have kind of a view or an offering on your question, but I don't know, Mary, if you've worked with private organisations who might have evidence or have spoken to you about this, but I don't really have an answer to your question. Yeah, that's why I think there's a lack of evidence, and I think that's our central premise, is we need to make sure we're making any policy reform is based in kind of a greater evidence to inform us, to ensure we don't have those kinds of unintended consequences, or to make sure we safeguard against them.
Sure.
Senator, I might just add the Fair Work Act contains a suite of protections, one of them being the general protections, which provides protections in relation to various attributes. It may well be, while perimenopause and menopause aren't specifically included there, we've certainly got attributes related to sex, so it may well be that those menopause and perimenopause would fit within that, but also... Don't they, though? Pardon?
I guess I'm just seeking a clear answer as to whether discrimination on the basis of someone being needing to manage their, reasonable symptoms of perimenopause is discrimination or not if an employer doesn't allow them to do that.
Well, certainly, and this is the other part that I was going to say, we obviously have the ability under the Fair Work Act to have personal leave in relation to illness or injury. So, for example, to the extent that menopause might manifest by certain symptoms, and if there is, prejudicial action taken against that employee in relation to their employment, the Fair Work Act would provide that protection.
Sure. So, sorry, I was just thinking about what you were saying. So, I guess, effectively, part of your recommendations are around commissioning more research. Do you guys have then? Could you give us some insight on what you feel that research should look like, and should it? And you talk about, this, being a whole of health sort of solution. What we should critically involve in any future research to ensure that, ultimately we have the right outcomes and we don't, end up driving down the wrong road.
Sure. So I think the first thing we need to establish is if menopause is the cause of early retirement or women reducing their participation in the economy. And I think we have a small amount of Australian research that is suggestive of that, but it doesn't create a direct causal link.
Sure.
And there isn't clear evidence about whether it's menopause is causing the uptake of paid or unpaid leave, or whether it's moving women to part-time work or to exiting the system. So that would be the first thing I would suggest. I think we need some more research on how menopause is impacting different cohorts of women and their economic participation decisions and the consequences it's having for their economic security. And I think we could use more research on what guidance, resources and workplace policies are in place already, and what would be practical and large-scale steps to that end that might help women and their economic participation in the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That makes some sense, because some of the stuff that we were hearing through the different hearings was, it was like the menopausal impacts were sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. So you've got caring obligations, there are family obligations, there are so many things going on, and it's almost like, well, something's got to give. And for many women, it's their job that gives, because they're not going to give up and don't tend to give up the caring responsibilities. And perhaps if there was some different flexibility or awareness in the workplace, that wouldn't be necessary. And I guess what my concern is, if, a woman who is at that point needs flexibility to keep her there, that's an easier fix than leave, where someone might go, well, do we really want women in this cohort? Or a woman to go, well, if I need to leave, then maybe I'm not up to it, when you're already not feeling so great, and that may actually cause you to, leave your job as well. So it's how we're framing it, as between being sick and not sick, effectively.
Yeah, I think there's definitely evidence that is suggestive of those things, but there's not enough evidence that's creating that direct causal link to inform us. Yep. Yeah. And what would be transformative or help create a difference to allow them to stay too. We don't really know the answer to that. Yeah.
Thank you. That's it for me, Chair.
Okay. Senator Waters.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much for giving us your time tonight and for the work that you do in your respective organisations. Ms White, can I start off with some questions for you? In your literature review, which I think you said you'd finished in May 2023, you made a series of what I consider to be fairly sensible recommendations that identify the gaps in the research and suggest those gaps be filled. Has the government responded to the recommendations you made in that review?
No, the government hasn't responded, and that's partly because of this inquiry, wanting to make sure that allow this inquiry to take its course, and that's why we provided our literature review to you.
Okay. Yeah. But this review didn't get initiated until November of 2023, some 6 odd months between when you tabled this literature review. What was the cause for the lack of action in that time?
We provided advice to the Minister, and she made the decision for us to provide our advice to you, our literature review to you. So, I think that would be a question for the Minister, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, just the timeframes not quite making sense to me. So if you gave this to the Minister in May...
We didn't give it to the Minister in May, we gave it to the Minister in October. We had a change of leadership in the Office for Women, and it took a while before we provided the literature review to the Minister.
I see, and that's the explanation for the denial. Okay, thank you, that makes sense. So has there been any, despite there not having been a response as such to the recommendations, has anyone in the organs of government been charged with doing the research that you've identified as needing to be done?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Why?
Because my understanding is the government's interested to allow the Senate inquiry to run its course and see what advice you bring forward.
Okay, okay. Has the Office for Women done any policy work on either flexibility in the workplace or leave in relation to perimenopause and menopause?
No, they haven't.
Okay. And I note that you've said that some of the policy belongs with health, so I understand that. We've got them coming on next. Which parts would belong with Office of Women? The workplace aspect?
Not really, actually, Senator. The Office of Women's role is, as you know, we're inside Prime Minister and Cabinet, and it's really kind of coordinating and collaborating across government to try and bring kind of the different threads of government together, but we don't actually hold policy responsibility for any of those kind of elements that you've referred to. So it would be employment and workplace relations and my colleagues at the table.
Okay, okay. And would you be aware if employment and workplace relations was doing that policy work?
We do speak to them regularly. Yeah. I don't personally. I did speak to them ahead of coming to this, and from my understanding, they're not.
Okay, so nobody is, right. Okay, has the Office for Women been tasked with having a look at the scope of WGEA's jurisdiction and their ability to collect data, particularly around the effects of peri and meno in the workplace?
I think, as you're aware, Senator, we have sought some legal advice about their jurisdiction and their collection of data.
Yes.
In the context of the review that was done previously on the Workplace Gender Equality Act, and in that context we are continuing to work with WGEA on how that review is implemented, recommendations from the review are implemented.
Yes, thank you. So I was referring to that specific legal advice, and I do have some questions for Ms Wooldridge in a moment, but the legal advice said it's not within the scope. So my question was, have you been tasked with looking at expanding the scope so that WGEA can continue to collect that information which they previously collected on a voluntary basis?
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take that on notice. I don't lead that side of the work in the Office for Women, and I don't want to mislead you with an answer, so I'm going to take that on notice if that's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would that be people in the office, or again would that be somebody else in the...
Another part of the Office for Women that works most closely with Ms Wooldridge, so I'll just take that on notice so I might make sure you give the correct answer. Okay,
thank you for that. So just for clarity, you said you don't have areas of policy responsibility, but you would have policy responsibility for WGEA. Okay.
Yeah, correct.
Important clarification.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. What do you make of the figure from the Australian Institute of Super Trustees that estimates that menopause costs the economy $17 billion in lost earnings and in lost super each year? You did reference that in the review.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like everyone here, we're concerned that there may be a direct link between women experiencing perimenopause and menopause, reducing their time at work or dropping out of the workforce. And I think, like I said earlier, we're not confident there's enough research in Australia to create that direct causal link, but certainly there is evidence suggests that that is probably what's happening, but understanding exactly what's happening and why and what the reforms are, I think, needs more work. But certainly it's concerning.
Okay. And hence your recommendation to do the research.
To do more research, that's
which
correct.
Magically has to wait for this committee to do it. So I'm glad we're so powerful. Senate committees aren't often that powerful, if I do say so myself. Can I ask now, Ms Wooldridge, just in relation to the voluntary question that you mentioned, you used to ask and you had a good response. Well, you had a 10% response and many of those employers were doing some great things. Was your question about gendered leave only, and did you or do you also ask about flexibility in relation to perimenopause and menopause? Or was it purely about leave that you were asking?
Thanks, Senator. We ask a number of questions about flexibility generally, about the type of flexibility that's provided by employers, and they're ongoing questions that we've been asking for a number of years. The question in relation to gendered leave was very specific to the question that I mentioned in my earlier statement of is it provided in addition to sick leave or personal leave, and it was those specific fertility-related gendered leave question. So that we haven't linked flexibility to menopause or perimenopause. Flexibility is asked as a standalone question broadly for all employees.
Okay. Is there any interest in asking a gendered flexibility question? Do you think you could, within your scope, noting that the legal advice said the leave was for some reason that baffles me and that I don't agree with, but I'm not allowed to see it, legal advice, could you ask about gendered flexibility in the workplace under your current scope of responsibility?
So I believe that we are probably asking the extent of the flexibility questions that we're able to ask currently, although we always review and always seek to understand how we can capture information in relation to latest thinking or emerging evidence. But connecting the two seems to be beyond the scope of what our instrument allows us to collect at this point.
But your instrument could be amended by the government of the day to allow you to commence collecting that data again, either on flexibility or on leave.
So there's multiple ways that the instrument, that we can have capacity to collect further information. Under the definition of the gender equality indicators in the Act, there's an opportunity under Clause F that any matters specified in an instrument under subsection 1A by the Minister. So the Minister has the capacity to determine or advise, request information, further information is captured consistent with the broad purpose of the Act. And in fact, sexual harassment was collected for many years under that clause of an additional, at the request of the Minister, until very recently it was put in as a gender equality indicator in its own right. So
we don't even need to amend the Act. The Minister could just make an instrument saying collect data on workplaces either offering or not offering flexible work on the basis of gender, maybe peri or meno specifically, or gendered leave, peri or meno specifically.
So the Minister has that flexibility, as long as it's consistent with the broad purposes of the Act, to specify additional information that can be collected from employers, or the Act can be amended. So they're the two options.
Great. Yeah. And did the legal advice say that the Minister could use that instrument pathway, or did the legal advice suggest that the Act needed to be amended?
I haven't seen the legal advice, I'm sorry.
Can we get a copy of it? Can we ask as a committee for it to be tabled?
My understanding is that we can't give you a copy of it, but I'm happy to take that on notice and check.
Okay, thank you. Ms Waldridge, can I just ask, we've absolutely loved the data set that WGEA collects, and it tells a really useful story, in particular about seniority and, you know, whether there's a gender differential in seniority, which we clearly know there is. But what I'd really like to know is, do you track the age of people in those various junior, middle, senior roles? Can we already know what that story is from the data, or are you not tracking age along with seniority?
So the great news is, for the first time in the reporting that's just being completed now, age of the employee has been a required field in which to report for all employers.
Okay, good.
So we've collected it voluntarily previously, and the changes to the instrument at the beginning of 2023 put both age and location in as required information to be provided by employers. So we will have information across the board in relation to age. Unfortunately, what we don't have is the ability to track individual employees over time, because we don't connect employees from year to year. So we'll be able to look at a snapshot of what's happening in the profile of the workplace in those different categories, but the data set does not allow us to track employee journeys as part of that. So we'll have quite a lot of information, but perhaps not as much as the committee may wish.
So it's a bit hard to be able to attribute whether perimenopause or menopause symptoms might be causing a departure or a change of seniority.
we will be able to look at the profile of the workforce at those ages, at different occupations and categories and those sorts of things, but not the employee journey.
Yeah. Okay. And just one final question, if I've got time, Chair. Yeah, great. Can I ask the Ms. Vosky. Thank you, Vosky. This committee's heard evidence asking for amendments to Section 65 of the Fair Work Act to include menopause as a reason to be able to request workplace flexibility. If that were to occur, what would that mean for workers? Can you give us a sense of what that would enable an employee to ask for?
So, essentially what that would mean is that the person would, so long as they met that circumstance in Section 65, they would be able to request changes to to her working arrangements because of those circumstances, and obviously with the changes that came in with closing loopholes. There's also the ability to seek arbitration in the Fair Work Commission in relation to that if a request is refused.
Okay, can you just give us a bit of a flavour of what might be requested? Just perhaps some examples from other contexts that might make that a bit tangible for us?
A change in hours, so for example, part-time or changes to start and finishing times, patterns of work, so job sharing, split shifts, also changes in location to working from home, for example.
Okay, and is that, there's a list of people that can already avail themselves of that right to request flexibility?
Correct.
And so this would simply expand on an existing right that some workers already have?
That's right, yeah. And obviously, depending where a woman might be in her journey, we know that one of those existing circumstances is where the employee is 55 or older, so that may well already capture a certain proportion of those people, but perimenopause, I think, starts quite a lot earlier, unfortunately.
I'm so glad that you know that.
Yeah, I do.
That's good. And just lastly, does the Ombudsman have any view on the advantages or otherwise of a leave approach versus a workplace flexibility approach? Excuse me.
Well, look, workplace flexibility is something that we already encourage all employers and employees to do, and certainly it's something that's not dependent on a particular class of employees. It's something that we encourage across the workplace. So I wouldn't necessarily say that one is mutually exclusive of the other. We would actually encourage that both of them are there together. We obviously have leave entitlements, as I've already foreshadowed previously as well, and, those are an important part of the puzzle as well. But flexibility, I think, as we've spoken about before, it's about trying to encourage continued employment and employees being able to avail themselves of those flexibilities.
Great. Thank you so much for your time tonight, all. Thanks, Chair.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask, I'll start with a question for Wajir. 98% of organisations say they have a policy on sex-based harassment or discrimination. Is your understanding, and I think the things you report against are some attributes in the Sex Discrimination Act, but not all of them. So it includes pregnancy or potential pregnancy, but it doesn't, for example, currently include sexuality or gender identity. When you ask that question, what's in the bucket of what you expect an employer to understand their obligations to be? And I'm taking as a given sexual harassment. I'm in particular interested in reproductive health, periods. What do you think people mean when they answer that question?
Thanks, Senator. So it's a very broad question, and actually this year, once again, with the data that we're just collecting at the moment, we will actually collect a lot more information under that question related to the Respect at Work reforms around that. So at the moment, the question is just asked at that very macro level about if there's a policy for sex-based harassment or discrimination. And we usually point to the advice from Fair Work and the Sex Discrimination Commissioner in relation to our expectations about what that might look like, but we don't specify details. We will this year, when we release the information later this year, have more insight, but it doesn't go to the level of detail that you're describing.
Does pregnancy or potential pregnancy cover someone's need for leave to schedule an appointment for an IVF treatment?
I think that would be a question to the Ombudsman.
Look, certainly from a best practice perspective, we would encourage employers to make leave available for that. Often, policies supplement what might be required by the legislation. It's around the causal components of the Fair Work Act entitlement are illness or injury. So it will depend exactly why somebody might be attending that appointment. But having said that, we would certainly encourage if someone needs to attend a medical appointment, that would be appropriate that they get that they're able to access their leave entitlements for that purpose.
Look, we certainly heard from many women who say it's unclear to them whether painful periods, flooding, would meet the definition of an illness or an injury, and on that basis, it would seem fairly obvious that many people struggle to interpret that around fertility treatment as well. Are there any precedents around this through Fair Work that we know of?
I would have to take that on notice, and certainly around jurisprudence on that. But I mean, to the extent that somebody is experiencing symptoms, that should be enough to be able to trigger the ability to take personal leave for that purpose. But I would, I'll take it on notice to see if I can provide any further information or clarity around that.
Yeah, I certainly get the impression from the evidence before our committee that some women through the course of their life have really felt like they're seen as weak in the workplace if they need to take a day off for period pain, and that therefore it would be of benefit to see, how it can be spelled out to say that there's a level playing field with a migraine or a bad period pain in that regard. Can I ask, so if Fair Work, that doesn't explicitly necessarily include IVF treatment, but we think it does, what about under the Sex Discrimination Act?
I'm sorry, that's outside my remit in the Fair Work Act, so I'm not sure. I think we'd have to take that on notice and see if we might be able to speak to the AHRC. I'm happy to take it on notice, Senator, and get back to you. Or they will get back to you probably, but I can't comment on that. I'll have to ask the Human Rights Commission, I guess, for a clear answer around their interpretation of that and whether they have had any conciliation around it. But if IVF is included under discrimination under the Sex Discrimination Act, what does that mean for example, a woman in a religious-based school who has been discriminated against for using IVF, for example, but belongs to an employer that said, yes, of course we've got a sex-based harassment policy on
discrimination. I know we don't live in a perfect world, but we are trying to work through how we create space for women's reproductive lives here. So I'm really trying to unpick the connecting threads between all of these different acts and the reporting, and then the entitlements that women should have access to. Have you got any guidance for me on how to unpick that?
From a WGEA reporting perspective, the question is very broad. So, and this is one of the things that we continue to work through and try and get some more detail. But even if an employer had some aspects of sex-based harassment policies in place, they could confidently say that they did. It doesn't mean that they've necessarily got the full comprehensive suite that would cover all of those abilities. So WGEA reporting happens at a more macro level than some of that nuanced detail
Yeah, of course,
that comes
sometimes
through.
we don't know until someone takes a case to the Human Rights Commission or the Fair Work Commission. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in with just a couple of questions before we go to the break. Thanks for your evidence today. Ms Wooldridge, I just wanted to ask you, in your opening statement, you referred to the data you had and the number of organisations who were providing leave. I was just wondering if you had any further information, even if it's anecdotal, around the effectiveness of such policies or other adjustments policies which might be in place in workplaces which are beneficial for women. I mean, there's quite a debate here around the value or otherwise of having menopause leave or a particular kind of leave. There has been evidence we've received around workplace adjustments, which can be really effective in keeping women in the workforce, but hard to see their application in a factory floor or in a childcare centre. So I'm just interested in terms of the information you might have. And again, I appreciate it doesn't need to be the most perfect of data. It could be anecdotal, but if you wanted to weigh into that conversation at all.
Sure, and thank you, Senator. And I think that's why we reflect on the advice we give employers, is that there's not yet the evidence base on leave in relation to that being the solution for this, and that the focus on having a flexible working arrangement is something they can confidently implement now that is clearly articulated as incorporating fertility-related leave, whether it be menopause or menstruation, endometriosis, etc. And that enhancing the workplace language, conversation, literacy in relation to what some women might experience through the life course in different ways is actually very valuable, and we can confidently give the advice that is something they should be doing now to help retain and create an environment for older women and women as they age in the workplace. And that we would really welcome the option of leave. And even anecdotally, I met with a number of employers in the last few weeks. Some are implementing menopause leave and fertility leave currently. They see it as beneficial. They've had that feedback from their employees. And we just continue to say, great, let's keep in touch and hear. But it really is emerging, I think, in terms of what the experience of that is, and particularly the environment of older women talking to sometimes younger, particularly male managers on the specificity of this type of leave can be quite a challenging concept, especially in those factory floors and some of those environments that you've mentioned.
Yeah. But just to be clear, you don't believe the evidence base is yet there for a universal application of a right to a particular leave here in this space?
No, and what I do, obviously that's in the policy context, I couch that in the advice that we provide to employers, which is, go strongly on creating that flexible working environment, the education and the literacy, and the jury's out in relation to leave still, and more information and evidence would be helpful on that.
Additional leave, or are we actually talking about being able to use your existing personal leave entitlements for these issues. And I think we're still talking about the latter in that context as well. Like, it's still not clear the extent to which you can.
So we clearly advise that personal leave should be able to be used for the full range of fertility-related needs that women or men may have. The issue is additional days of leave where it's specified under a definition of fertility or menopause-related leave, and the need to specifically identify that type of leave in terms of being able to take it. And that's where I think that some employers are going down that path, a small number, but not insignificant. But that's where I think the evidence can be. Would be really valuable to do that additional research to understand what the impact of that type of leave and what the take-up is and how that's been effectively managed would be very valuable to inform any further consideration of it.
Thank you, Ms Wooldridge. I'm conscious that I've just stepped into the chair in the chair's absence, and I don't want to get in trouble by going over the break that we have agreed. But thank you very much for your participation in our inquiry and the questions you've taken on notice. I believe answers to questions on notice are due by close of business on Friday the 23rd of August and gratefully received before then if they are ready. But thank you very much. The committee will take a brief suspension and resume at 7 p.m.
Thanks. Thank you. I welcome representatives from the Department of Health and Aged Care and the Therapeutic Goods Administration. Thank you very much for appearing before the committee this evening. The Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Commonwealth officers are also reminded of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised, and a copy of the order is available from the Secretariat. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full names and the capacity in which you're appearing this evening? And I'll start at this end, please.
Thank you. Louise Riley, Assistant Secretary, MBS Policy and Reviews Branch.
Duncan McIntyre, First Assistant Secretary, Technology Access and Assessment. Excuse me, I've been in the role about 2 months, but I'm hoping I can help you.
Professor Robin Langham, Chief Medical Advisor of the Health Products Regulatory Group.
Belinda Roberts, Assistant Secretary, Health Equity Branch.
Tracy Lutton, Assistant Secretary, Regulatory Compliance Branch.
Thank you. Does anyone have any opening remarks before we go to questions? No? Okay, I'll go to questions. I'll start with Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Chair. Hello, everyone, and hello again, Professor. Thanks for joining us for a second time. Can I start off firstly with the department? In the May budget of this year, there was a $1.2 million allocation to Jean Hales, which I understand was to make their existing course, Managing Menopause, which usually costs $75 cost-free, to support health practitioners to better care for women. And I have asked about this funding in estimates, as I'm sure you recall, and I was informed that it was awarded to Jean Hales because I believe you said that's where most people get their information. Can I just ask on what basis and what metric did you use to determine that?
Thank you for that question. So there was a few considerations that did go into the decision to provide funding to Jean Hales.
Can I just get you to sit a bit closer? Could we have hands
I can move closer, of course. Is that better?
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Sorry. I was just saying there was a number of considerations that did go into the decision to provide funding to Jean Hales for the menopause support. So obviously the government, through the National Women's Health Initiative, has been funding the Managing Menopause course as well that Jean Hales do offer, including a review and a redesign of that course. So we're looking to leverage that existing funding. And a number of other considerations, such as the RICGP and ACRIM accreditation of that course for CPD purposes. accredited for 2 types of activity: educational activity and reviewing performance hours as well. And also, I think the capacity of Jean Hales, we know that a number of health professionals, when they are looking to upskill in women's health, will go to Jean Hales, and there's opportunities that when they are doing that to engage them in the menopause course that they have been rolling out as well. And I am aware that Jean Hales are looking to work with the Australasian Menopause Society to build on their expertise as we move into implementing this budget measure, including, we'll be, I think, at the estimates hearing we did mention we're looking to expand that to other health professions as well to make sure as many people as possible are trained.
Thank you. So I was going to ask why AMS didn't receive the funding, but I think you've just explained that. Thank you.
A number of areas, it builds on the existing investment that the government has made in this course and builds on the other areas. But we're really pleased to hear that the AMS will be supporting Jean Hales in this project.
Was that voluntarily decided by Jean Hales, or was that a condition government placed on the funding?
I think the idea was from Jean Hales, but when they approached us, we were very supportive of that and have also engaged with the AMS to thank them for their engagement through this project.
Did the AMS have any funding support from government?
I'm not sure if they receive any, not that I'm aware of in my areas, but certainly we can take on notice whether they receive any funding from government.
Yeah, because I'm just noticing your language about building on existing funding. It sounds like if you're getting money, you'll keep getting it, but no other new entrants would ever get money if that's the barometer of whether you get government funding or not. I'm sure that's a blanket generalisation, but yes, how might AMS seek to be considered in things like this if they're not already in receipt of government funds?
I think for this particular course it was because we are looking to leverage the Managing Menopause course, which is run through Jean Hales. But yeah, I'm happy to take on notice whether there are other funding that we do give to AMS.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask now about whether the department's been asked to look into domestic manufacturing of menopausal hormone therapies? I think I did ask you this in estimates and you said no. In light of this inquiry and the evidence that we've received so far, is that something that you'll reconsider? I'm sorry, I don't know who to ask that to, whoever the most appropriate person is.
Senator, I can take a start for that. The department doesn't have responsibility for domestic manufacture, but has regular discussions with the Department of Industry about issues associated with the interest of pharmaceutical companies in domestic manufacture, and as you'd be aware, there are a number. But we don't have a direct role in providing support or advice to those companies directly. The supply chains associated with most of these drugs are global and the markets are global. So in the discussions we have with drug companies about particular therapies, they're usually doing most of their manufacture in one place in order to serve multiple markets. And hence
the suggestion for domestic manufacturing to overcome any global shortages.
Right. So where they manufacture in Australia, they usually serve many overseas markets as well as Australian domestic markets, and likewise in their portfolio of drugs, they usually provide services to Australia that come from other countries that serve multiple markets. So those are decisions for those companies to make about how they best serve those markets, and we certainly have periodic discussions with them about where they might choose to place their manufacturing effort.
Okay, forgive my ignorance, but does the government make any medicine?
Does the government make medicine? Not to my knowledge, but no.
Did it ever?
I'm sorry, I'd have to take that on notice.
Okay. I think maybe it should start thinking about doing that, but maybe that's just me. Can I ask the TGA, please? During the inquiry, we've heard quite a lot of concern about shortages of various medicines, and quite a lot of concern also about how to get medicines listed on the PBS. And we've heard a bit about, I'm sorry, I'm not sure who I'm directing this to. I think this one's Riley. Hagen. Yeah. Great. Is there any consideration for reform to the PBAC process, specifically for peri and menopause treatments? Because we're hearing that the requirement for a lowest cost comparator is essentially a barrier to new medicines that might have fewer risks associated with them or might otherwise be a more modern and desirable or medically appropriate treatment for a patient. We're hearing that lowest cost comparator test is essentially meaning that they won't ever get on the PBS, and so only rich women will be able to afford them, which seems very inequitable to me and to many of us.
Senator, the PBAC is obliged to provide advice about how medicines compare to other medicines that have already been listed. Sponsors of those medicines, so the companies that bring them forward, are responsible for providing evidence to PBAC about what the most appropriate comparators would be based on whether they can provide evidence of superiority. So if a company can bring forward a drug in a way that demonstrates that it has a superior clinical outcome to drugs already listed on the PBS, then PBAC can make a finding that an appropriate higher price can be charged than existing medications. But if a medication is brought forward without evidence that it is superior, then that cost comparator with existing medicines is the one that's applied, because we have an obligation to ensure that medications are cost effective. So if it's the case that a company can demonstrate that there is clinical evidence that something has, for example, fewer side effects, that clinical evidence can be considered by PBAC, and if the company can make a case that the clinical outcome as a consequence is superior, then PBAC may be willing to recommend a higher price than a currently listed price. But it is commonly the case that there's an assertion made that a particular drug has a higher clinical efficacy, but PBAC isn't satisfied that the evidence that it's provided demonstrates that. So we do hear periodically from companies claiming that they have a drug that has a superior outcome, but PBAC will look at that evidence that they provide, and then it will provide advice to the minister based on what they present.
Can you just elaborate, please, on superior? Who gets to say what's superior and what's the scope of what is looked at to determine superior clinical outcomes? Yes,
so the starting point is that a sponsor provides information to the committee as part of their submission. Then PBAC has a series of processes involving subcommittees and clinical and economic experts that have a look at that information, and they also seek to gather additional information where it's appropriate for them to do so in order to establish whether there is an improved clinical outcome. That clinical and economic advice is then put to the committee, and on that basis the committee makes recommendations, and those recommendations are published on PBAC's website, which is part of the Department of Health's site. So in terms of determining superiority, that decision is made by members of PBAC who are typically eminent clinicians and health economists.
Are they generalists or specialists? Do you have different various subgroups that can really know what's superior and what's not?
Yes, so PBAC has amongst its members, when appointing members to PBAC, there's an attempt to try and get the broadest possible range of different kinds of advice from people with different specialisations. They're also able to call in additional expertise where they require that expertise to supplement what the expertise of the committee. The membership of PBAC, I can certainly provide it to you on notice, but it's published information. So
yeah, thank you. That'd be useful.
There are a variety.
How many of them are there?
I'm sorry, Senator, I'd have to get you the exact number. I think there's about 20 members of the committee.
Do any of them have expertise in perimenopause or menopause?
I'd have to take that on notice.
Thank you. I'd also be interested in the gender balance as well, so thanks for providing that. And just lastly from me, Chair, and then I think I'm done, is we had a suggestion that potentially one alternative means of applying the lowest cost comparator test could be to treat body-identical progesterone as a different class of drug to the bioidentical or synthetic progesterone. What does the TGA say to that? Would that fly?
I'm sorry, I missed the question, expecting a cost comparator question. Could you repeat the question for me?
Yes, so we had a suggestion that body-identical progesterone be treated as a different drug class precisely because it's body identical and not bioidentical, which we've taken extensive evidence about, and one's synthetic and one's not, effectively. Is that something that could justify the body identical progesterone being considered in a separate class, ergo it wouldn't need the lowest cost comparator test applied to it in order to get PBS listing?
So the TGA doesn't get involved in classification of drugs. We register independent individual hormones, medications, drugs. So it's really, in terms of the classification, it is a question for the PBS.
Yes, and in terms of PBAC's consideration, a sponsor could put the argument that you've just made in their submission, and that argument would be considered by a PBAC. And if it was considered that there could be a demonstration of superiority by that new class of drug and that it would provide a superior clinical outcome for patients, then it would be theoretically possible for them to make a recommendation of a different cost comparator. But it would be based on the evidence put forward by the sponsor.
Okay.
Senator Smith, and then I can come back if necessary.
Thank you.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair. First up, I just want to ask about the data the department currently has on the public health impacts of menopause, particularly in terms of mental and physical health, and whether you've identified gaps in that data or areas to further explore.
We do have a number of data sources that we do use, Senator. Let me just bring up my notes. But so I should start there. I think there are some gaps in terms of that data, and we are, through the most recent budget, we have funding that is available to the AHW to develop a sexual and reproductive data set. We are hoping that menopause will be part of that and that we can get a national some national consistency in the data there. So that's one of the key functions, as well as a number of other surveys that we do have that do provide picture of that, the health and wellbeing of women who may be experiencing perimenopause or menopause. So the Australian Longitudinal Study for Women's Health is one of those key data sources, and happy to kind of provide some of the findings of that or take that on notice if you'd like some more detail on that. There is also, through the funding that we provide Jean Hales under the National Women's Health Initiative, that it did include a women's health survey in 2023 that related to menopause, and is another data source that we do use. And then obviously, you know, some of the emerging research that comes out, we look to utilise that as well.
I'm happy for you to take this on notice for us so we can have a look at it in a bit more detail, but especially around the mental health impacts and what data you already have. But if you could take it on both, but I think that's an area where we've heard quite a bit of evidence, and it's just not quite clear what we know and what we don't know in that space as well as we start to develop our recommendations. I'm going to jump around a bit, apologies, because my questions are not ordered in the way you're seated. But I want to come to the TGA now, so Professor Langham, about, I think the nice way to describe them is alternative products on the market to assist women with their symptoms of perimenopause and menopause. Another way to describe them might be junk products on the market, which propose to support women with these symptoms. We've heard a bit of evidence around how these alternative products are or may be regulated, and that there may be an issue with the degree or level of regulation of such products. I'm not sure if you've seen our evidence over the course of the inquiry, but we've had a number of women say, you know, they're being marketed these products, they do nothing. Others saying not only that, they might be dangerous for women. Can you just step us through sort of what role the TGA has here, and what sort of powers or opportunities there are for you to step in as a regulator?
So thank you for the question, Senator. For a drug to be legally supplied in Australia, a therapeutic good must be included on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, we call it the ARTG. Higher risk products, such as drugs containing hormones, are registered medicines, and they must undergo a TGA evaluation as of safety and quality and also efficacy. For lower risk products, and these are most vitamins, herbal medicines, traditional medicines, they're able to be entered on the ARTG as listed medicines. And that's following a self-certification process by the sponsor that relates to the chemical compound created that's within those agents. Listed medicines in Australia are not TGA pre-market approval, as in there's not a process of safety, quality and efficacy, but they must be made under a licence of good medical practice, a good manufacturing practice. They can only contain pre-approved low-risk ingredients. They can only make low-risk pre-approved health claims. And they must have evidence that supports the claims that they're making, and they must also comply with all advertising and labelling requirements of the Therapeutic Goods Act. In relation to the evidence that sponsors must hold for herbal medicines, this is usually evidence of traditional use, which is considered to be 3 generations or 75 years of use. And where a sponsor relies on evidence of traditional use, this must be clearly stated on the label and on the advertising material. I think one of the products that's been mentioned, Happy Hormones, that's Ms Kaz Cook referred to, it is included on the ARTG as a listed medicine, and it is regulated by the TGA, and as such it must meet all legislative requirements for listed medicine. And the label and the advertising material does clearly state that traditional ingredients are used in Western herbal medicine in accordance with legislative requirements. I acknowledge from Ms Kaz Cook's statement that there were concerns about advertising and misinformation, which is part of the TGA's overarching regulatory overview. Ms Lutton, would you like to comment on the advertising and the misrepresentation and misinformation?
Hi, thank you for the question. We're also concerned about consumers accessing incorrect, unbalanced or misinformation through social media platforms, influencers and so forth. We have a range of tools, both reactive and proactive, in regards to managing that misinformation or those endorsements by influencers and so forth. From an education perspective, we have developed significant resources to help social media platforms to assist with influencers who are going out there and identifying some aspects in regards to any products that they're sponsoring or influencing in regards to that. So there's a significant amount of information on our website to really help in regards to what they can say, what is lawful content and what are some of those endorsements in regards to those products. We also have a very much a reactive space in regards to any of that information, from removing of websites through disruption and working with a lot of the platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok and so forth, where we will identify things that we don't think are appropriate or unlawful or go against the advertising code, so we can disrupt those websites and have those platforms remove that information. We also have the ability under Section 313 of the Telecommunications Act to block that site, and so any consumer going onto that site will be redirected to the TGA, where it will advise why they have been redirected and why we have concerns with the information being made available on that website. So there's a variety of tools in that respect. If we find there are certain advertisements or websites or parts of the sector making claims or unlawfully promoting goods in regards to that, we can also look at some tools such as infringement notices, civil penalties and criminal. We will try and work with a lot of these sites in regards to the information they're supplying and try and get them to voluntarily take that down. Where that doesn't happen, we will go into the reactive space in regards to some of the tools we can use in that space.
How many of these sites, handles, pages have you disrupted for these sorts of issues when it comes to menopause and perimenopause related products?
I don't have the specifics for menopause specifically, but I can take that on notice for you. But over 23-24, we sent over 4,800 content removal requests to sites such as what we're talking about, but some of them will have more than menopause information on there. It might also have information in regards to weight loss, cosmetic injectables and items such as that. So I can get the details if I can in regards to menopause specifically.
I really appreciate that. And I mean, I know you've got a big job on your hands because, you know, it's coming at us, and we've heard that evidence. I think it would be really useful for us to understand in a bit more detail, if you can take this on notice, you know, of the powers that you have to intervene in a regulatory sense, how often you use them, and in the different mechanisms in which you can do that. Can I just ask as well, I mean, we also heard evidence that some of the reason that some of these products aren't really well regulated, or, sorry, this is a paraphrase of others' words, it's not my reflection on you, but they're not well regulated because they're treated as food products under the legislation. So can you just respond to those?
So, in Australia, any products that are intended for oral consumption may be regulated as a food or medicines in law, depending on a number of factors such as the ingredients, the overall presentation and the types of claims that are being made by the product. So products that are classified as therapeutic goods are regulated by the TGA at a federal level under the Act. Products for oral use that are not regulated as therapeutic goods are likely to be regulated under food legislation, and that's the Food Standard. Australia, New Zealand is the Commonwealth statutory authority responsible for that. I won't talk about food. In general, products that are regulated by the TGA, if they come within the definition of therapeutic goods, and for medicines this means there's a claim that they're either preventing, diagnosing, curing or alleviating a disease, an ailment, a defect or an injury, or anything that's influencing, inhibiting or modifying a physiological process. So claims such as relieving the symptoms of menopause would be considered therapeutic claims, and so therefore they are considered therapeutic goods, and they are regulated by the TGA.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to can I put something on notice for you guys to come back to us on? We haven't really gone into this very much, but in terms of what the government is doing around equitable access to women's health, but specifically as it might be menopause related for women in rural and remote areas, if there's any information you can give us on the policy work which might be happening in that space, and also any data you may have on experience of women in rural and regional areas, and medical training, just the role the department has in overseeing and accrediting medical training. We've been kind of given a bit of a runaround on this question by various witnesses, so just interested in the kind of intersection with you guys on that regulatory space and what involvement you may have either to regulate, engage, influence there. If you could come back to us on that, appreciate it. Thank you.
You've got 3 minutes.
Oh, I thought you were rushing me.
No, I just wanted to ask a very quick clarifying question.
Oh, well, I put it on notice anyway, so I'm happy. If you're happy to take it on notice, I'm happy to leave it at that. Thanks, Chair.
All right, thank you. Professor Langham, just a clarifying question. When you said, you talked about the two classes of products that are regulated under the TGA.
The two sorts of classes of registration, of being registered on the ARTG. Yes, there's the higher risk products which must be registered, and the lower risk products which are listed.
Is there anything, because it occurs to me that one way that people could tell, for example, if something has had any level of scrutiny by the TGA, and the other is one could be TGA regulated and TGA listed actually on the bottle. Does that appear on those products?
I'm not, as far as I know. That's not part of our labelling requirements under legislation.
I wonder whether that's something that we as a committee should consider, because if I'm a consumer walking into a shop, if I can at least see that this is TGA listed versus this, which is just a food, that might help consumers.
We don't have anything to do with food, as I've said.
No, but what I'm saying is it would differentiate it for the customer. whether it fits in that category, or doesn't at all. Okay, I'm going.
So we don't have anything to do with food. Sorry, just to answer, but there is a code, if you like, on all of the medicines, whether it's either there's an AUSL label or an AUSR, so that gives you that differential.
I'm sure consumers know exactly what that means and what the difference is.
I guess the point I'm making is maybe we could look at making a recommendation about making that more clear to consumers so they could make those decisions. I'm conscious of the fact that Senator Hughes has to go and do temp chair duty, so I'm going to go to Senator Hughes and then I'll circle back around.
Thank you. One of the things, and I don't know if we have anyone MBS related here, so one of the things that has been raised with us is regards to gynecological Medicare items and a longer gynecological appointment. Is that under consideration? Is there any development on that at all? Because what we've been hearing is some of the time that's required in some of these appointments are not only, it's not only just about sort of the menopause, but also other preventative measures tied around it. So you're actually talking about preventative care rather than someone waiting around on a public health waiting list forever and a day and ending up in a situation of critical care. So is there any movement or anything that we're seeing around longer Medicare items that allow for longer consults with gynecologists?
So Senator, there isn't consideration at the... So actually I'll take a step back. So generally the MBS works on general consultations, which are time-tiered. Specialists as opposed to consultant physicians, so gynecologists are specialists. They currently have access to a number of time-tiered items, but nothing that is like, for example, and I think I discussed this with Senator Waters at Senate Estimates, there's going to be a new item introduced for a longer consultation for patients with endometriosis and chronic pelvic pain. So that was certainly something that the government announced and will be implemented soon. A similar item for gynecologists with, for an in-depth consultation around menopause or perimenopause isn't currently under consideration. I guess the other thing to point out is we've recently introduced GPs now have access to a lot of this care is done by GPs. GPs now have access to a level E consult, which is what we refer to as a consult for 60 minutes or longer. That's relatively new on the schedule, and also I think it's starting from 1 March next year. We're also introducing the same time-tiered consult for nurse practitioners.
So one of the concerns there is that we've heard an awful lot of evidence around GPs either not having the knowledge when it comes to menopause and saying to women, you're too young, that's not what it is, sending them off, not understanding or having any understanding of menopause or what it might look like for a variety of women. But then also a very outdated fear of treatment when it comes to MHT. So, it's one thing to say, but women will be able to go to GPs for longer consults, but we've also got, on the other hand, a big problem in the GPs that they're not trained in it, they don't understand it, they don't think women under a certain age could even be close to it or need to look at it, and they're not recommending or prescribing what the treatment is for a majority of women, which is now a safe treatment. It's outdated information that they're working on. But we've also heard that GPs are referring women to specialists saying, I'm not prepared to prescribe MHT. They should have it, but I'm not prepared to prescribe it. So, how are we going to bridge this gap? Because it's all well and good to say GPs can have a 60-minute consult, but if the 60-minute consult ends up in nothing, how are we going to bridge the gap?
Well, the professional training of GPs is the responsibility of the colleges, as you know, and I'm sure you've heard that in hearings.
And we've met with them. Yep, so you may.
Just to follow up to Senator Hughes' question around the long consults with GPs, some of the evidence that we also heard earlier in the inquiry is that some GPs, particularly GPs who are choosing to see women in peri and menopause who have significant numbers of long consultations are then getting investigated or audited and questioned as to why they have so many long consultations. Are you able to speak to that?
That would be a question for our benefits integrity. I can't speak to that. Sorry, Senator.
Could you maybe take it on notice? Yeah, because that was definitely a concern expressed by GPs, that where they are choosing to focus particularly around menopause and perimenopause, and so that basically the bulk of their consultations are long, they're getting questioned around that.
So I will just also add to that, when GPs claim a consultation, like the MBS data that we see, it's transactional data. In those general consultations, we don't know what happens. If a GP, says they're doing lots of consultations on perimenopause or menopause, we can't see that in the data. We can see they're claiming lots of long consultations.
I guess the point is...
Well, we heard from a menopause clinic who has GPs specialising in menopause, so their consults are all generally longer, yet they are experiencing audits because of the consults they're putting through. But the clinic, outrageously, has menopause in its name. So,
Yeah, we can take that on notice.
Thank you. Sorry, Senator.
Thank you. I just wanted to touch on the shortage of MHT, and I know it's a global shortage. Do we have I know through COVID, obviously the TGA was very involved with the Health Department in ordering of vaccines. Is there an ordering system of treatments that are used, or the stockpile of medicine? How does that work with the ensuring there's enough of a product, or that the product's ordered into the country? Who orders the product in?
Well, I might take that if you don't mind, Senator.
Anyone.
Wasn't my phone.
I'm not picking a person. No.
As far as I know, the government doesn't play a role in ordering supplies of medications for use unless it does meet the requirement of what might be in the national stockpile, or what's the other one? The national significance, the drugs of national significance. So, no.
However, it is, Senator, it is the case that if drugs are listed on the PBS, that that pharmacies are obliged to provide them within timeframes, and if they're in shortage, there are mechanisms that allow substitutes to potentially be made available. So there are a range of things to assist.
So there is a shortage of patches, right? We've heard that everywhere we've been. Women come in and say that they just cannot get patches. There's... Sorry?
Ones they do give you are very itchy.
Right. But there's, other products and like Estrogel Pro and things, and we've heard from those that aren't listed. Now, I don't know whether they're superior or not, but the reality is you can't get what you want. So whether it's superior or not, if it's a replacement, if it's a product that's just as good, when you can't get the other one, why isn't there some mechanism? I understand the mechanism around superiority, but when you don't want 3 million very cranky women running around the place because there's no substitution.
The TGA does have regulatory powers for mitigating shortages, and for sponsors who have registered products on the ARTG, they are required, as part of the registration process, to notify the TGA when there is a shortage. And currently the shortage of HRT patches, which, as we've said, is a global issue, it's various factors. It's not just the manufacturing issues of the major products, but there was also a discontinuation of a brand of patches called Climera, which put further strain on supply. The government's not able to demand a company produces or whatever. Our roles in terms of mitigation are largely to, firstly, to approve any overseas registered alternative products so that they can be imported and supplied in Australia without necessarily going through the process of TGA's pre-market evaluation, safety, quality, registration. So there is a supply of overseas products that are considered, and this is on a temporary basis under Section 19A of the Act, and some of these are subsidised on the PBS. As well, we have a role in publishing shortages. We have a web page, and as well for HRT, we've created a specific web page for the HRT shortages. And our information from the respective sponsors is that the HRT transdermal patches are expected to, the shortage is expected to be resolved in August and September of this year, and so that's included on our web page. And as well, we work with TAD to issue a notice under the Community Service Obligation Deed, which enables CSO distributors to constrain available supplies and facilitate equitable distribution of PBS-listed patches. So this notice allows the SODs to use their expertise in relation to supply and to independently determine the practices that they can adopt to support equitable supply. We do have other tools that are available for us when something is in incredibly scarce shortage. We can issue an SSSI, a scarce shortage something or other instrument, but that really you need a substitution that's readily available in order to be able to for that to be useful. There isn't one. There isn't one. You're right. Well, not for the patches. I guess from a in terms of
another form of hormone therapy that's
what the clinicians really are able to do, and that's gels and tablets and vaginal pessaries and so forth. That's not something that can be done through an SSI because that's something that is an automatic tool that can be done at the pharmacy level. When we're talking a completely different formulation and completely different drug, then that's something that needs to be done through the prescriber. So the SSSI is not of any use. We do have other mechanisms, but that for this particular product, the other tools really aren't available. So we are working hard to ensure that overseas registered products are available, and also to keep the communication and the open information about where the expectation of resolution of that shortage might happen. I might add that the TGA really does take the issue of medicine shortages and the problems being experienced by the Australian community very seriously. Earlier this year, we initiated our own review of our medicine shortages program and undertook a fairly comprehensive consultation process of a lot of stakeholders, identifying where the problems, where the barriers, where the solutions might lay. We now have a series of draft recommendations that we are sort of putting the final touches to, where we think that the handling of medicine shortages in general could be improved, and we're hoping to have that to the Minister by later this month.
Are the patches that are approved for the PBS, are they only used for women going through menopause, or are they used by other members of the community?
Senator, we could on notice let you know what the restriction is on the way that medications are prescribed. So the way it works is when a prescriber is considering what the right treatment for a particular patient is, if they think a particular drug is the correct thing to prescribe, then depending on the drug and things such as whether it could be dangerous if misprescribed, how expensive it is and other things like that, sometimes it's available for them to prescribe to any patient. In other instances, there are restrictions that apply to the way in which they can prescribe it, and there are a variety of checks and balances to make sure that those things are prescribed to the right people.
So what I want to know is this MHT therapy prescribed to women for menopause only, or are there other cohorts that it is prescribed for?
It's a really interesting question. When the TGA registers a high-risk drug, such as these hormonal patches...
Are they a high-risk drug? Because that's...
they're considered, when I'm talking about registration or listing, they're not a low-risk over-the-counter. They're considered a drug that does need an element of regulation whereby evidence around their safety and efficacy and quality must be presented and evaluated for registration. And during that process, the evidence around their use for treatment of alleviation of symptoms of women undergoing menopause or perimenopause is part of the indication. So it's central to the evidence of what we would register a drug for. So a drug will be registered for a particular use. And once that drug is registered for the particular use, and the PBS is able to consider whether that drug is then supported funding for that particular use on the PBS.
It hasn't answered the question.
Hang on, I'm getting there.
Other groups than women.
I'm getting there. With a lot of drugs, it's recognised that drugs have other uses in the community, and doctors are still able to prescribe that. But it's called off-label prescribing. And when that happens, it's not supported by the PBS. So we have no data to understand where off-label prescribing exists. If in some cases, and I really don't know what other medical conditions might be utilising a patch, but I imagine there might be some transgender clinical events or clinical patients that might benefit from their use. I don't know, but I'm just hypothesising.
Notice for me, because
again we would have no data
that women who cannot afford MHT, who are going through significant, horrific experiences in some cases, are not able to access this because it is being prescribed off-label for other sorts of hormone therapy.
We have no data. We have no evidence.
You must have data how many are prescribed off-label.
We don't. That's what I'm trying to say. When someone
prescribes... There's no linkage between how many are in the country and how many are prescribed under the PBS.
Women using IVF use these patches.
Well, that's a group. So I'm asking a group.
So when a doctor prescribes off-label, the doctor does so understanding that they are the person that's now responsible for determining safety and efficacy, that this is outside the regulation of the TGA for any off-label prescribing of a drug.
Right, I have to go, but if there is any further information you can get, and IVF women, that's fine. I'm just interested. We've heard this is a menopause inquiry, perimenopause inquiry. We've heard desperation from women, unable to access them, driving from pharmacy to pharmacy. What other groups, whether on-label or potentially off-label, would be accessing these kinds of therapies?
That's a question for the clinicians.
Yeah. Senator, what we can do is provide you with data about on-label use, so use that's prescribed that leads to a PBS drug being prescribed, and we can give you information about the restrictions that dictate the kinds of patients that can get those prescriptions. So we can give you that information, but we won't have any data about off-label prescription.
So who would be able to provide that? Prescribers, which is every GP?
Well, it would be up to really the clinical prescribers, the clinical groups that are involved. And thank you for the note about IVF.
On that?
Senator, the data we have is because when something is prescribed on label...
No, but I'm asking who do I ask then? Because trying to get information in this sector is a nightmare.
There's no central repository of that information.
No one would know how many people are doing it off-label.
If it's on label, we have the data because the Commonwealth is
we'll ask the
paying
college.
For it. But if it's off-label, it's not.
That's all right. I'll put a question on notice to the
College
GP.
of GPs or RANSCOG or ACRM.
Yeah. I'm looking at my staffer to pay attention to that one. That's what we're doing.
Senator Pratt, and then I'm still going to come back to you, Senator. Thank you, Chair. I've got a quick question about the Women's Health Survey. If other researchers want to look at that data, is it available for release for them to use?
Survey. I have to double check with Jean Hales what the access arrangements are, but we can certainly confirm whether that's
I know
possible.
that the company that did it provided a data package. I'm presuming that was to Jean Hales and not to the government?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, okay. If Jean Hales hasn't got it to release, I would be interested in the department asking, even if it's just access for the committee. One of the things that's arisen is that there are other researchers trying to look at statistics and data and women's experiences and look at different surveys. And it was noted that they didn't have access to this data. It would be terrific if we can see if we can support that. Speaking of data, can I ask to what extent we think My Health Record and the Digital Health Agency and their arrangements for releasing data will be able to give us a picture of, for example, women's health during life courses, access to equitable treatment, who's got access to Medicare and who doesn't, what things have conditions have women been diagnosed with, what do we think that looks like and what should it look like?
So thanks, Senator. So My Health Record, it's not currently, the data in it is not currently available for research and public health purposes. You've probably heard that before. There's some legislative and governance changes that we would have to go through and technical arrangements to make that the case.
And that would come before us. When is it nearly ready, or that's got to go to government first and then?
So we're currently working on a roadmap which will look at a staged implementation for bringing in research and public access to the data that's held in My Health Record. In terms of the time frame for that, that's being developed in close consultation with the Australian Digital Health Agency. Unfortunately, sorry, Senator, I don't have a time frame, but certainly in the future, the research and public health use of My Health Record data, we could look at that in terms of perimenopause and menopause.
That's terrific. And if we want to ask, sorry.
I just want to add one caveat. There'd be legislative changes required to make the data available for those sorts of things. So, of course, if we get there, it's subject to a decision of government and that legislation being passed.
But that legislation is being worked on currently.
So not the legislation.
The roadmap is, but not yet.
Not yet, yeah.
So I guess I'm asking because I'm interested really in lifting the priority that government gives to bringing that kind of legislation forward so that we've got a better, more data available on women's experiences for research purposes to really see what's happening. To what extent do you think it would be useful for us to quiz the Digital Transformation Health Agency more explicitly on this? I think probably what you've given us is probably about as much as we're going to get at this point.
Yes, I would think that was the case, Senator. I guess I'm sure you're absolutely aware of the sensitivities around the use of My Health Record data. There's a lot of sensitivities around whether people want to have a My Health Record and whether they opt out of one and things like that. So it will require, an extensive consultation process and looking into all the risks and benefits and the best approaches for that.
Are you able to tell us what the growing uptake of its use looks like? I know it is being used more and more, but I guess I still worry about how many people opted out.
Yes. So sorry, Senator, I'd have to take that on.
That's fine.
notice.
It's probably a little bit beyond the scope of what we're here to talk about. Can I ask, in the context of PBS data, do we know how many people are taking hormone replacement therapy? Do we know how old they are? My presumption is when it comes to Senator Hughes' question about do we know what the off-script cohorts are, my presumption is that it's IVF, that it is transgender people, but that you won't always be able, most people's gender identity legally and on their documentation will align, we'll have them recorded, for example, if they're using female hormones, they'll be recorded as female in any case. So it might be quite hard for Senator Hughes to find the answer that she thinks she's looking for there. But my question really is, what we're looking at, the number of scripts, who they're being issued to, what will it tell us about perimenopause and its treatment in Australia currently?
So, Senator, I'm quite happy to, on notice, get you an authoritative answer about precisely what data is available. Yeah. Generally, of course, we've only got data on what's on script or what's PBS medications.
But we've now got e-scripts.
They're also PBS scripts if they're covered by the PBS. So
okay, but because I can see in my health record, for example, my off-script prescriptions, just because that script's come to me through an e-script, I'm still getting my off-script scripts through an e-script that end up in my health record. Do you not have the data of that, or because it's not the PBS you can't release it?
I would need to take notice that question. I obviously, my expertise is in the PBS, but we can get you an answer about what happens to the data about e-prescriptions.
Menopausal woman with lots of scripts coming through.
Yeah, but what we can do is we can also tell you what the indications are for which. So what we don't know is what the particular condition that was presented to a prescriber was. So we don't know what that person went to the prescriber for. All we know is what drug was prescribed.
Yeah.
So we can tell you what drugs were prescribed, but not why. Mm-hmm. But that still gives you probably quite a bit of information.
There's growing evidence, for example, that some doctors and that women are finding relief from symptoms through the prescribing of testosterone. That's outside, I think, the AMS guidelines, and probably outside. Well, I'm presuming it's outside the PBS and. It may well, I don't know if the TGA has made a decision around that or not, but if we wanted to establish a body of evidence and say, okay, there's a dire need for clinical trials because there's so much diversity in prescribing, what could we be asking government to do to give us that picture back to medical communities themselves so they can look at and validate efficacy?
So the data that we can provide is about what drugs have been prescribed, and if they're being prescribed for purposes that are outside the prescription restrictions that are available on the PBS, we won't have data on that. And we don't have powers that would allow us to compel that data be provided either.
I might answer the question, Senator, from the perspective of whether a drug becomes indicated for a specific condition, and that might be part of your question. At the moment, testosterone would be indicated for particular deficiencies in men because that's what the clinical trial evidence would have been that was presented to the TGA to enable that. For a drug to have an addition to its indication or an extension to its indication, that will require a sponsor to come back to us with the level of evidence required in order for that to be deemed appropriate for that extension to be added. And again, once that indication's been added by the TGA, it then makes it an opportunity for the PBS to support it. For indications, though, it's not always the very large, pointy and randomised controlled trials that are needed. Increasingly, regulators around the world are understanding the value of what we call real-world evidence, which can be observational data. It can be really well constructed and transparent and properly supported registries. So that sort of stuff is equally accessible for the TGA to be able to consider the evidence base for an extension of indication of a drug.
And I guess that's what I'm interested in, how we use the reporting systems like, for example, My Health Record in the future and other systems that might already exist but not quite be there to get that observational data so that we can re-inform ourselves. Do you have any suggestions as to how we make a reflection back to government of how to accelerate that?
I might be confused by the question.
I think that goes back to my response earlier about Senator.
My health record.
Okay. And of course not just the Australian Digital Health Agency, but AHW are the data custodians as well. So it wouldn't, we'll be working with them on the roadmap too.
Thank you, Chair. Senator Waters, to finish us off.
You talked before about the 19A substitution, but I think you said that you wouldn't get the PBS discount applied on the substitute. So thinking of it from the consumer's perspective, if they've had to have a substitute because there's a shortage of their original medicine and they're used to paying $4.30, but now all of a sudden the substitute is $50, how come we can't have temporary PBS subsidies on the substitution so that patients can actually afford the substitute?
There are on the Sandoz products, and I think that was Sandoz products. There's 3 of the Sandoz products, 3 strengths of estradiol Sandoz products, which is available under a Section 19A, which is included as a PBS subsidy. And that was from the 1st of July of this year.
Is that because they're already on the PBS though? I'm asking about the situation where something is not.
Section 19A imported into the country, and the PBS has allocated a funding subsidy to those products as of the 1st of July. So that issue has been addressed, and the patient will never have to pay more for the substitute where there's a shortage of the original. For those products.
Is that an automatic thing, or do the products have to be specifically listed?
It's not an automatic thing, in my understanding, but Duncan, you might like to talk about that a bit more.
Briefly, please, because I've got a lot of other questions.
It really depends on the class of medication, but if there's a medication that's not available that is listed on the PBS, but an identical medication with the same brand, the same dosage, basically all of the things are the same, is available overseas, then there can be an automatic application of the subsidy through the PBS. If the drug is similar but not the same, then it has to be considered by the TGA and then subsequently be considered by PBAC, the committee behind the PBS, to make a recommendation about whether it's appropriate for that to be a substitute, because it's not the same.
Do they generally apply the subsidy for the substitutes?
Well, they provide advice. So if they consider it to be the same, then if they consider it to be the same for the purposes of its listing, then their advice would be that it's the same, and therefore a similar approach might be taken, provided the sponsors provided enough information and the price is appropriate for it to be able to be subsidised, and they've assured themselves that that's an appropriate and necessary substitution. Sometimes
sorry, that was a lot of words and it's late and I'm tired. It's not totally my fault and not yours. I just want an answer to, can a patient always get a 19A substitute at the PBS subsidised price, or is that some decision that the TDA or PBAC or somebody has to make?
There are lots of different drugs and they all have different paths. So if the question is
perimenopause
always,
and menopause.
if the answer is if the question is always, then the answer is it depends. But if there's the same drug and substitution, then it would be listed if it's exactly the same. If it's similar, then they'll provide advice about whether it's considered the same for this purpose.
And my follow-up question was,
then
is the advice generally that it be subsidised?
It depends.
Okay, could you please take on notice how many times that they have advised that the substitute product be subsidised and ergo the same cost to the consumer as their original medication, and how many times they have not recommended that? And could you flag any that are in the peri or menopause space? Thank you. Can I ask now about the length of MBS appointments? We've taken quite a bit of evidence from both patients but also practitioners who've asked us to have a specific MBS item for peri and menopause, and they've noted the 60-minute consult, and I have a different question about that in a moment. But there's, and they've also noted the 45 to 49-year-old midlife MBS item that currently exists, but for some reason that seems not to be meeting the needs of GPs. Is there? You were asked this earlier, and you said it's not under consideration to have a specific item for peri or menopause. Why not?
Gynecologists it isn't, and not for GPs. And Senator, I think I've said this to you in a different setting. Generally, we prefer general consultation items. That allows the practitioner to treat whatever the patient comes in to talk about, which might be their perimenopause symptoms and to check a mole on their back or to update other scripts. It's the length of the consultation that allows for the complexity.
Okay. So that leads me to the next question is, we took evidence that there's diminishing returns to the GP in offering longer consults. Yes. You get paid more for the first 15 minutes than if you had 4 15-minute appointments, you get roughly double what you get as if you have one 60-minute appointment. So mostly female GPs who are doing these longer consults are actually facing a gender pay gap. That's another matter. But the point is, if there was a specified MBS item for peri and menopause, perhaps it could be financially advantageous and attractive for GPs to provide appropriate medical care for perimenopausal and menopausal women, because they're saying that the current system is a disincentive to them doing so. Is that being looked at to fix?
So certainly the issue about remuneration for longer consultations, for those consultations that might be, like the most commonly used consultation for general practitioners is an item 23, which allows for consults up to 20 minutes. Certainly those consultations that are up to 40 minutes or up to 60 minutes, certainly we acknowledge that the rebate probably doesn't reflect. It's certainly, like, if you look at it on a per minute basis, it drops off quite significantly, the value of that time. There's a recommendation from a few years ago from the MBS Review Task Force to look into those time-tiered arrangements in the primary care space. And that's a review that's about to get started by the MBS Review Advisory Committee. So they'll be looking at the time-tiered item structures for all of those time-tiered general consultation items that are in place for GPs and nurse practitioners, and there'll be a consultation process, including targeted and public, and it's about to commence. That committee is meeting next week, and it'll essentially kick off that review next week.
Okay. So in the absence of that, which will probably take many more years to conclude because it's taken forever already, but I wish them all the very best and I hope they do a very nice prompt job. Given that might take some time, is there consideration for an interim MBS item, if there even is such a thing, for peri and menopause, so that there's, for the reasons I outlined earlier?
So currently that isn't under consideration.
Okay. Should it be? I think it should be. Why don't you think it should be?
Well, I think it should be part of this review process, because I think probably there would be a call for longer consultation items for all sorts of conditions, or to better remunerate those consultations for, whether it's dealing with complex perimenopause and menopause symptoms, or complex complexity for patients going through cancer treatment, or you could list a whole number of them, and it's important that we provide better remuneration, or look at the item structure to see if it adequately remunerates those consultations for whatever the patient comes in for.
Okay, fair enough. What is the timeframe then on when that review will be concluded?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the MBS Review Advisory Committee, they're meeting next week, so essentially it kicks off then. It will be, there are about 300 items in scope, so it will be quite a complex review. It's important that there be probably both targeted and public consultation processes. I anticipate it'll take, I can't presume how long the committee will take, but I anticipate probably 18 months to 2 years.
Okay, and that's for them to make some recommendations.
Yes.
And how long has the last MBS review recommendation sat on the shelf for? It's like 6 or 7 years now. So
I will say, Senator, of the 1,400 recommendations that were made in that review, close to 1,100 of them have now been implemented. So there's been significant process in implementing those. We don't like to see recommendations sitting around for a long time, but they are subject to government consideration and the usual budget processes.
Okay, thank you. Can I just flag, we took some really important evidence from a couple of professors in Brisbane. Professor Odette Best was one, and for the life of me I can't recall the second professor's name, but there was an absolute dearth of research on what First Nations women need or currently understand about or are lacking and need help with in peri and menopause. Like, it was embarrassing. There was one study, and I think it was in WA, that had a small component, but there was no actual research either by, ideally, or even about First Nations women and their needs in this time of life. That's not acceptable. What's being done to fix it?
Senator, we don't have anybody from the research area here, but obviously there is a grant round that is out for the Medical Research Future Fund. I'm not sure. I think that...
They have a slide.
Yep. So that process is underway at the moment. So, I think that's probably one of the key research opportunities there. I'm just trying to check. I think that they are looking at priority populations as part of that process.
Yes, there was some concern about the level of competitiveness of that grant and the tininess of the grant that was available. It was still perceived as a disinterest by government in resourcing this research area. So if you could take that feedback on board, it'd be good to have them get that grant, but it would also be useful for government to fund broader research by First Nations communities. I think that can be my last question. Thank you for staying a little bit after time. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Senator. Look, thank you very much for giving us your evidence this evening. I note there were a number of questions that were taken on notice. We request that answers to those questions be provided to the Committee Secretariat by close of business on Friday, 23 August 2024, and we'll be reporting to the Senate on the 17th of September 2024. That concludes today's hearing. Thank you to all witnesses who appeared and to Hansard and Broadcasting for their assistance and to the Secretariat for their support. Again, questions on notice provided by 23rd of August. We're reporting on the 17th of September and the committee stands adjourned.